3 bullets. That's all it took to end a war that burned through 2 cities, swallowed 14 lives, and turned a woman who once flinched at raised voices into someone who could stand over a dying man and feel nothing but the cold weight of the gun in her hand. But this story doesn't start with bullets. It starts with bruises. It starts with a woman named Kaylin Mercer standing in a bathroom at 5 in the morning, pressing concealer into the purple fingerprints wrapped around her throat, rehearsing the lie she'd tell the world today. If you want to know how a victim becomes a killer, how love becomes a cage and freedom tastes like gunpowder, stay with me until the end. Hit like. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Chicago had a way of making everything look clean from a distance. The skyline caught morning light like a row of polished knives, all that glass and steel throwing back the sun as if the city had nothing to hide. But get close enough, and you could smell it. The rot beneath the money, the fear beneath the ambition, the violence humming underneath every handshake that happened in the buildings where deals got made and lives got traded like receipts nobody bothered to keep. Kaylin Mercer knew this because she lived inside the gap between those 2 versions of the city every single day. 28 years old. Logistics analyst for Whitmore and Dane Development Group, one of the biggest commercial real estate firms in the Midwest. On paper, she was efficient, punctual, unremarkable. The kind of employee who showed up 10 minutes early, left exactly on time, never complained, never pushed back, never made noise. Her performance reviews said things like dependable and detail-oriented, which were corporate ways of saying nobody noticed her, which was exactly what she wanted. Because if people noticed her, they might ask questions. And if they asked questions, they might see what she spent 45 minutes hiding every morning before the sun came up. The bathroom in the apartment on North Wicker Park had good lighting. She'd chosen it for that reason, though she'd never admitted it to herself. Fluorescent strip above the mirror, harsh and unforgiving, the kind of light that showed everything. She needed to see everything so she could cover everything. Foundation first, then concealer, then powder to set it. The bruise along her left jaw had turned that sick greenish-yellow color that meant it was a week old, which meant it was harder to hide because the edges had spread and the color was uneven. The fresher ones across her ribs were easier in a way. Nobody saw those. Long sleeves, high necklines, blazers buttoned to the collar, even in July. She had a system. The system worked. The system had kept her alive for 3 years. Adrian Cross was still asleep in the bedroom when she left that morning. She could hear him breathing through the door, that heavy, wet sound he made after a night of drinking, and she moved through the apartment like smoke, gathering her bag, her keys, her laptop, her travel mug of coffee that she'd prepared the night before so she wouldn't have to make noise in the kitchen. Every motion rehearsed, every footstep calculated. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which cabinet hinges squealed. She knew that if she closed the front door too fast, the latch would click loud enough to carry down the hallway and into the bedroom, and then he'd wake up. And if he woke up in the wrong mood, she wouldn't make it to work at all. The door closed silently behind her. The October air hit her face and she let herself breathe. This was the best part of every day. The 27 seconds between the apartment door and the elevator, the brief window where she belonged to nobody, where the fear dropped from a scream to a whisper and she could pretend just for a moment that she was a normal woman going to a normal job with nothing underneath her clothes except skin. The elevator came. She stepped inside. The doors closed. And Kaylin Mercer disappeared back into the lies she'd built around herself like armor. The meeting that changed everything was supposed to be routine. Whitmore and Dane was negotiating a joint development deal for a mixed-use tower project on the near west side. 42 stories, retail on the ground floor, luxury residential above, underground parking structure, the whole gleaming package. The kind of project that required sign-offs from city planning, environmental review, zoning variance committees, and about 15 different people who each had the power to kill the entire thing with a single phone call. Kaylin's role was data. She prepared the logistics reports, the construction timelines, the supply chain analyses, the spreadsheets that made complicated things look simple so executives could nod and feel smart. She sat in these meetings the way furniture sits in a room, present, functional, unnoticed. The conference room on the 31st floor of the Whitmore and Dane Tower smelled like new carpet and cold coffee. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, Lake Michigan stretching gray and endless to the east, the city sprawling south and west like a circuit board someone had set on fire. 12 people around the table. Legal, finance, development, project management. Kaylin sat at the far end with her laptop open and her reports printed in neat stacks, waiting to be called on, expecting nothing. Then he walked in. Roman Vescari didn't enter rooms the way other people did. There was no announcement, no dramatic pause, no theatrics. He simply appeared in the doorway, and the entire temperature shifted. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups froze halfway to mouths. The senior VP of development, a man named Gerald Hoffman, who weighed 260 pounds and had a voice like a diesel engine, actually stood up from his chair. Roman was tall. Not imposingly tall, but the kind of tall that came with proportions that made expensive clothes look inevitable. Dark hair cut short and precise. A face that might have been handsome if it weren't so completely still, like someone had carved it from something harder than bone and forgotten to install the mechanism that allowed for warmth. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Kaylin's monthly rent, and he wore it the way soldiers wear uniforms, not for appearance, but for function. His eyes were the problem. Dark gray, almost colorless in certain light, and they moved across the room the way a scope moves across a field. Measuring, cataloging, dismissing. Every person at that table got evaluated in the span of a single glance, and most of them failed whatever test was happening behind those eyes without ever knowing they'd been graded. "Mr. Vescari," Hoffman said, extending his hand with a smile that showed too many teeth. "We're honored. We weren't expecting you personally." "Plans change." Roman's voice was low, unhurried, completely flat. He shook Hoffman's hand the way you'd handle something you weren't sure was clean. "I want to see the logistics breakdown before we discuss numbers." Hoffman turned. Everyone turned. 12 pairs of eyes landed on Kaylin at the end of the table like spotlights hitting a deer on a highway. "Kaylin," Hoffman said. "You're up." She stood. Her hands were steady. 3 years of living with a man who could snap from laughter to violence in the space of a heartbeat had taught her how to perform under pressure. Fear was just background noise now, a frequency she'd learned to tune out the way people who live near train tracks stop hearing the trains. She walked them through the report. Supply chain logistics for structural steel, concrete delivery schedules, crane availability and permitting timelines, labor allocation models. She spoke clearly, concisely, without filler words or nervous qualifiers. She was good at this. This was the one part of her life that worked exactly the way it was supposed to. When she finished, the room was quiet. Roman Vescari was watching her. Not the way Hoffman watched her, which was with vague professional approval. Not the way the finance guys watched her, which was with impatience because they wanted to talk about money. Roman was watching her the way you watch something you're trying to understand, focused, patient, like he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. "Solid work," he said. Nothing else. Then he turned to Hoffman and the meeting continued. But Kaylin felt something crack inside her chest. Not pain, something worse. Recognition. The feeling of being seen by someone who actually knew how to look. The meeting lasted another hour. When it ended, people filed out in clusters, shaking hands and exchanging business cards, and performing the rituals of corporate ambition. Kaylin gathered her materials quietly, stacking papers, closing her laptop, becoming invisible again. She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. "Ms. Mercer." She turned. Roman stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, silhouetted against the gray lake. Everyone else had left. The conference room felt enormous and empty, like a church after the congregation goes home. "Yes?" He studied her for a moment. His expression gave away nothing. "Your timeline on the steel delivery assumes a single-source supplier. What's your contingency if Midwest Structural defaults on the contract?" It was a real question, a smart question, the kind of question that told her he'd actually read her report instead of just watching her present it. "I built a secondary model with 2 backup suppliers out of Gary and Milwaukee," she said. "It adds 11 days to the timeline, but reduces single-point failure risk by 60%. I didn't include it in the presentation because Hoffman wanted the optimistic version." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Roman Vescari did not smile, but something adjacent to respect maybe or interest, or the kind of recognition that happens when a predator encounters something that doesn't immediately run. "Send me the secondary model," he said. "I'll need authorization from—" "Send it to me directly." He produced a card from his jacket pocket. Plain white. Heavy stock. Just a name and a phone number. No title. No company. No email address. People who needed to explain who they were on their business cards weren't powerful enough for it to matter. Kaylin took the card. Their fingers didn't touch, but the air between them felt like something solid, like static before lightning, and she pulled her hand back a fraction too fast, and she knew he noticed. He noticed everything. "One more thing," he said as she reached the door. She stopped, didn't turn around. Something in his tone had changed, dropped half a register, lost its professional edge, become something quieter and far more dangerous. "Who put those bruises on you?" The world stopped. Not slowly, not dramatically, but completely. The way a heart stops between beats. The way time stops in the space between a car accident and the impact. Kaylin stood in that doorway with her back to a man she'd met 90 minutes ago and felt every wall she'd spent 3 years building crack from foundation to roofline. Her throat closed. Her fingers went white around the laptop bag strap, the concealer, the foundation, the powder. 45 minutes every morning, flawless technique, nobody saw, nobody ever saw. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice came out steady, perfect. 3 years of practice. Silence from behind her, long enough to hurt. "Fair enough," Roman said. Not challenging, not pushing, just acknowledging the lie the way you'd acknowledge weather, noting it, filing it away, moving on. "When you're ready to stop surviving and start choosing, call me." Kaylin walked out of that conference room and made it to the women's restroom on the 29th floor before her legs gave out. She locked herself in the last stall and pressed her forehead against the cold metal partition and breathed. In, out, in, out. The way the therapist she'd seen once, 2 years ago, before Adrian found the appointment card and broke her phone and her wrist on the same night, had taught her. Nobody saw. Nobody ever saw. But he saw. That sentence burrowed into her skull like a splinter and stayed there for the rest of the day, through afternoon meetings and email chains and the long commute home on the Blue Line, where she stood pressed between strangers and stared at her own reflection in the dark window and tried to recognize the woman staring back. "Who put those bruises on you?" 6 words. 6 ordinary words arranged in a question that nobody in 3 years had thought to ask. Not her coworkers. Not her neighbors. Not her mother in Bloomington, who called every Sunday and accepted every excuse because the alternative was too terrible to consider. Not the ER doctor 14 months ago who'd set her fractured radius and noted "fall downstairs" in the chart without looking up. 6 words from a stranger with gray eyes and a business card with no title. She deleted his number from her phone on the train. Then she fished the card out of her pocket and stared at it. Then she put it back. Adrian was awake when she got home. She could tell before she opened the door. The television was on. Some sports broadcast, volume cranked loud enough to bleed through the walls. The sound itself wasn't the warning. The warning was what wasn't there. No smell of food, no ambient noise of movement, no signs that he'd done anything all day except sit and drink and stew in whatever poison was eating him from the inside. She opened the door. He was on the couch. 31 years old, 6'2", built like he'd played football in college and spent the years since then replacing muscle with something meaner. Handsome in the way that weapons are handsome. All edges and function and the promise of damage. He had a glass of whiskey balanced on his knee, and he didn't look at her when she walked in. "You're late." Meeting ran over. She set her bag down, took off her shoes, moved toward the kitchen. Normal. Routine. The choreography of survival. "What meeting?" "The Vescari Development Project. I told you about it last—" "You didn't tell me anything." He still hadn't looked at her. The television threw blue light across his face and turned his features into something hollow. "You don't tell me anything anymore." Here it was. The turn. She knew this rhythm the way musicians know time signatures. The slow build, the tension rising note by note. The moment where the composition shifts from minor key to something that hasn't been named yet, because the people who could name it are too busy bleeding. "I'm sorry," she said. Automatic. Reflexive. The word had lost all meaning years ago. It was just a sound she made to buy time, a coin she dropped into the machine that was Adrian Cross, hoping to delay the mechanism for one more hour, one more night, one more cycle. Come here. She went, stood beside the couch, looked down at the man she'd moved in with when she was 25 because he'd been charming and beautiful and had made her laugh and had held her face in his hands and told her she was the only real thing in his life. She tried to remember that man. Couldn't find him. Maybe he'd never existed. Maybe he'd been a mask that something else wore long enough to get inside the door. Adrian reached up and touched her jaw, gently. His thumb traced the line where the bruise lived under her makeup, and she saw in his eyes that he knew exactly where it was because he'd put it there. Who were you with today? Soft, almost tender. 12 people. It was a conference room meeting. I can show you the... Who looked at you? And there it was. The real question. Not who she'd met or what she'd discussed or how her work was going, but who had dared to see her. Because to Adrian Cross, Kaylin wasn't a person. She was a territory, and territories didn't get looked at without permission. Nobody looked at me, Adrian. I gave a report. That's it. His hand moved from her jaw to her throat. Still gentle. His fingers found the hollow at the base of her neck where her pulse hammered like something trying to escape, and he held it, not squeezing, not yet, just reminding her that he could. You're lying. I'm not. You always were a bad liar, Kay. The hand tightened. Not all the way. Not enough to leave marks. He was getting smarter about that, or maybe just more careful, learning the geography of damage the way cartographers learn coastlines, mapping exactly how much pressure he could apply before evidence appeared, but enough to make her eyes water, enough to make her body go rigid with that terrible animal stillness that prey animals adopt when the predator's jaws are already around their throat. And fighting would only make the teeth go deeper. Adrian, please. He held her there for 8 seconds. She counted. She always counted. Counting was the only thing that kept her from screaming, from clawing, from doing the thing her body desperately wanted to do, which was fight back. Because fighting back was how bones got broken and hospital visits happened, and the cycle reset itself with fresh apologies and flowers and promises that meant nothing. 8 seconds. Then he let go. Make dinner, he said, and turned back to the television. She cooked. Pasta with garlic and olive oil, simple and fast because complicated meals required concentration and her hands were shaking too badly for knife work. They ate in silence. He drank more. She cleaned up. He watched her from the couch the way guards watch prisoners, not with interest, but with the dull vigilance of ownership. At 11 o'clock, he went to bed. She waited 20 minutes, then crept to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bathtub with Roman Viscari's business card in her trembling hands. When you're ready to stop surviving and start choosing, call me. She put the card back in her pocket. She brushed her teeth. She went to bed beside a man whose breathing sounded like a machine idling between cycles of destruction, and she stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. 4 days passed. 4 days of routine. Work, concealer, silence. Adrian's mood swung like a pendulum between suffocating affection and cold distance, and Kaylin navigated both the way sailors navigate storms, not by controlling the weather, but by knowing which way to lean when the wave hit. She sent Roman's secondary logistics model from her work email. Professional. Detached. He replied with 2 words. Good work. She stared at those 2 words for 11 minutes and then deleted the email. On Friday evening, Adrian came home drunk and paranoid. He'd lost another freelance client, graphic design work that he picked up and dropped with the consistency of a man who believed the world owed him something it kept refusing to deliver. He was convinced someone at the design firm had sabotaged him. He was convinced Kaylin wasn't supportive enough. He was convinced the apartment was too small and the neighborhood was too loud and the whiskey was too cheap and every single thing wrong in his life could be traced back to someone else's failure to be what he needed. At 11:47 p.m., he threw a glass at the kitchen wall. It shattered and left a wet starburst of whiskey and fragments across the white paint. Kaylin flinched but didn't move. Don't move. Don't react. Don't give him the satisfaction of your fear because fear was fuel and Adrian ran on it like an engine runs on gasoline. You don't even care, he said. Standing in the middle of the kitchen with his fists balled and his jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. I'm drowning, and you just stand there. I care, Adrian. Tell me what you need. I need you to act like you give a damn. I'm right here. I'm listening. You're not here. He stepped closer. You're somewhere else. You're always somewhere else now. Where do you go, Kay? Who are you thinking about when you look through me like I'm not even standing in front of you? Nobody. I'm thinking about nobody. His hand came up fast. Not a fist. An open palm. It connected with the side of her head just above her left ear, and the world went white and sideways. And she hit the kitchen counter with her hip, and then the floor, and the linoleum was cold against her cheek, and she could see the broken glass scattered around her like little teeth, and she thought, with absolute clarity, this is how it ends. Not with a bang, with a Tuesday. But it wasn't how it ended, not yet. Adrian stood over her for a long moment, breathing hard, his face twisted into that expression she knew better than her own reflection. Rage and guilt and self-pity all tangled together into something that looked almost like grief. Then he walked to the bedroom and slammed the door. Kaylin lay on the kitchen floor for 3 minutes. She counted. Then she got up, picked the glass out of her hair, pressed a cold cloth to the side of her head, and sat at the kitchen table while the ringing in her left ear slowly faded to a high whine. At 12:34 a.m., she heard Adrian start snoring. At 12:41 a.m., she took Roman Vescari's card from her wallet. At 12:43 a.m., she put it back. On Saturday, she wore a hat to the grocery store to cover the swelling. On Sunday, her mother called, and Kaylin told her she was fine. On Monday, she went to work, and nobody noticed anything, because nobody ever noticed anything, because the whole world was designed to make it easy to look away. Then Tuesday came. Adrian had been drinking since noon. She came home to find the apartment destroyed, cushions torn from the couch, dishes broken in the sink, his laptop hurled against the wall and cracked open like a skull. He was sitting on the bedroom floor with his back against the wall and a bottle between his legs. And when she appeared in the doorway, he looked up at her with eyes that had gone somewhere she couldn't reach. "They're going to kill me, Kay." She froze. "What?" "I owe people money. Bad people. Not credit card stuff. Real money. Real people." His voice cracked. For one horrible moment, he looked like the boy he must have been once. Scared, small, drowning. "Hundreds of thousands. I got into something stupid. Sports betting. Underground stuff. The kind of guys who don't send collection notices." The room tilted. Kaylin gripped the doorframe. "How much?" 300. Maybe more. I lost track." $300,000? They gave me until the end of the month. That was 2 months ago." He laughed. A wet, broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. "I'm dead, Kay. I'm already dead." She should have felt something. Fear, maybe. Sympathy. The last dying ember of whatever love had once existed between them. But standing in that doorway, looking at the man who had beaten her, strangled her, broken her wrist, split her lip, and systematically dismantled every piece of her identity for 3 years, Kaylin felt only one thing. Tired. She was so tired. "We need to leave," she said. "Both of us. Tonight." "And go where?" He was crying now, messy and loud, snot running down his lip. "They'll find me. They always find people. That's what they do." "Then we'll figure something out. There's nothing to figure out." He lurched to his feet and the bottle shattered on the floor, and he came at her with that familiar speed, that explosive burst of movement that her body had learned to anticipate the way animals learn to anticipate earthquakes. A tremor in the air, a frequency beneath hearing, and then the ground opens up. His hands found her throat, both hands this time. Full grip. Not a warning, not a reminder. His thumbs pressed into her trachea, and the air stopped, and the world began to shrink from the edges inward, going dark and narrow like a tunnel collapsing. And she could see his face above her, contorted and streaming tears. And he was saying something, but she couldn't hear it because blood was roaring in her ears and her lungs were burning and her fingers were clawing at his wrists. But he was so much stronger. And she was going to die here in this ruined apartment with broken dishes on the floor and a man who claimed to love her squeezing the life out of her body. She kneed him in the groin. Not strategy, not courage. Pure animal survival. The oldest program in the human operating system firing because everything else had shut down. He doubled over and his hands released and she gasped, a raw, shredded sound like tearing fabric. And she ran. Out of the bedroom, across the living room, through the front door that she didn't bother closing behind her. Down the hallway in her socks because there was no time for shoes and she could hear him behind her, stumbling, cursing, calling her name in that voice that switched between rage and tenderness, so fast it made the word itself sound broken. Kaylin. Kay. Wait. I'm sorry. I didn't mean... Kaylin. She hit the stairwell, not the elevator. The elevator took too long and the doors opened too slowly, and he could catch her in the space between the chime and the closing. She took the stairs two at a time, her socked feet slapping cold concrete. 3 flights down to the landing between the second and first floors, where the fluorescent light buzzed and flickered and the walls were painted that institutional green that existed only in stairwells and hospitals and other places where people went when something had gone terribly wrong. She collapsed against the wall, slid down until she was sitting on the concrete with her knees pulled to her chest and her hands shaking so violently she could hear her own bones rattling inside her skin. Above her, somewhere in the vertical darkness of the stairwell, she heard a door open, then close, then nothing. He wasn't coming. He was too drunk, too broken, too deep in his own collapse to chase her down 3 flights of stairs. She sat in that stairwell and pressed her fingers to her throat where his thumbprints were already blooming purple against her skin. She could feel her pulse underneath, fast and terrified and alive. Still alive, still counting. She reached into the pocket of her work pants, the same pants she'd worn that morning because she hadn't changed when she got home. Because changing required going to the bedroom, and going to the bedroom required passing Adrian, and passing Adrian required a calculation she'd been too exhausted to make. The card was still there. White. Heavy stock. A name and a number and nothing else. Her fingers left damp prints on the paper as she dialed. It rang once, twice. Then a voice she'd heard only once before, in a conference room 31 floors above the city, low and unhurried and completely without surprise, as if he'd been waiting for this exact call at this exact hour on this exact night. Kaylin? Not a question, a confirmation. Her voice broke. Shattered like the glass on the kitchen floor, like the dishes in the sink, like every promise Adrian had ever made. I need help. Silence. 2 seconds. 3. Where are you? She told him. She gave him the address through cracked lips and a throat that felt like it had been filled with broken stone. And she heard nothing on the other end. No reaction, no judgment, no questions about what happened or why or how bad it was. Just the sound of a man already moving. Don't go back inside that apartment. Don't go anywhere. My people will be there in 12 minutes. Your people? 12 minutes, Kaylin. The line went dead. She sat in the stairwell with the phone pressed against her chest and counted. Not seconds, not heartbeats. She counted the bruises she could feel without touching them. The ones on her throat, the ones on her ribs, the old ones on her wrist that had healed crooked because she'd waited too long to see a doctor, the ones that didn't show on skin at all, the ones that lived somewhere deeper, in the parts of herself she'd locked away so completely she'd forgotten the combination. 11 minutes later, she heard footsteps in the lobby. And for the first time in 3 years, the sound of someone approaching didn't make her flinch. The footsteps were precise. 2 sets, heavy-soled boots on lobby tile, moving with the kind of rhythm that belonged to men who'd been trained to enter buildings where bad things lived. No hesitation, no conversation between them, just synchronized movement that echoed up through the stairwell like a pulse. Kaylin pressed herself deeper into the corner where the wall met the stairs. Her socked feet were numb against the concrete. The fluorescent light above her head buzzed and flickered in a pattern that felt deliberate, like the building itself was struggling to decide whether to illuminate her or let the dark take her back. The stairwell door on the ground floor opened. A man appeared at the bottom of the stairs, mid-30s, square jaw, neck like a fire hydrant, wearing a dark jacket that didn't quite conceal the shape of a holster underneath. He looked up at her the way a paramedic looks at a crash victim, professionally, without pity, already calculating damage. Ms. Mercer. Not a question. These people didn't ask questions. I'm Declan. Mr. Viscari sent us. There's a vehicle outside. Can you walk? She nodded. Wasn't sure it was true. Her legs felt like they'd been replaced with something liquid and unreliable, but she grabbed the railing and pulled herself upright, and her knees held, and that was enough. A second man waited at the lobby door. Taller, thinner, with watchful eyes that scanned the street in both directions before he stepped aside to let her through. A black SUV idled at the curb, engine rumbling low, windows so dark they looked like cuts in the side of the night. Declan opened the rear door. Kaylin climbed in. The leather seat was warm. The interior smelled like cedar and something clean and expensive that she couldn't name, and the contrast between this and the stairwell she'd just crawled out of was so violent that her body couldn't process it. She sat there with her hands in her lap and her throat throbbing, and she didn't cry because crying required energy and she had none left. Declan took the passenger seat. The tall man drove. Nobody spoke. They crossed the city in 20 minutes. North through Bucktown, past the highway interchange, into a neighborhood Kaylin didn't recognize. Tree-lined streets where the houses got bigger and the spaces between them got wider, and the streetlights seemed to exist not for safety, but for aesthetics. The SUV turned through a gate that opened without anyone pressing anything, rolled down a gravel driveway lined with pruned hedges, and stopped in front of a house that was the size of a small hotel. Not a house. An estate. Stone facade, 3 stories, dark windows reflecting the SUV's headlights back like a row of closed eyes. The kind of property that existed behind walls and gates and layers of legal entities designed to keep the owner's name out of public records. Declan opened her door. Inside, first door on the left, he's waiting. She walked barefoot across gravel that bit into her soles, through a front door that weighed more than she did, into a foyer with ceilings high enough to swallow sound. The first door on the left was open, spilling warm light across dark hardwood floors. Roman Viscari stood beside a desk in what looked like a study, bookshelves floor to ceiling, a lamp casting amber light that made shadows pool in the corners. He'd changed from whatever he'd been wearing, now in a dark Henley with sleeves pushed to his elbows, showing forearms corded with muscle and laced with faint scars that she cataloged automatically, the way one damaged person recognizes damage in another. He looked at her. She watched his eyes move from her face to her throat, watched them stop there, watched something behind them shift, not soften, not harden, but rearrange itself into a configuration she didn't have a word for. His jaw tightened. A single muscle twitched below his left eye. That was all. No gasp, no curse, no dramatic display of outrage. Just that microscopic recalibration of something internal, like a machine adjusting its settings to accommodate new data. "Sit down," he said. She sat. A leather chair near the desk, deep and soft and warm. Her body sank into it, and some primitive part of her brain released a signal that meant safe, and she almost lost it right there, almost came apart at the seams because safety was the most dangerous thing in the world for someone who'd been running. The moment you stop running is the moment your legs remember how tired they are. Roman sat across from her, not behind the desk, in a chair facing hers, close enough that she could see the texture of the scars on his forearms, the faint lines around his eyes that came from years of expressions he didn't allow himself to make in public. "Tell me his name." "Adrian Cross." "How long?" 3 years. "How bad?" She hesitated, not because she didn't know the answer, because nobody had ever asked the question in a way that suggested they actually wanted to hear it. "Bad enough," she said. Roman's hands rested on his knees, perfectly still. She noticed his knuckles, thickened and slightly misaligned, the way knuckles get when they've been broken and reset multiple times. Hands that had done damage. Hands that knew exactly how much force it took to crack bone. "He strangled you tonight." "Yes." "Has he done it before?" "Yes." "Has he used weapons?" "Once. A belt. Mostly his hands." Roman exhaled through his nose. Slow. Controlled. The kind of breath that holds something back the way a dam holds back water. Not by being stronger than the current, but by redirecting it somewhere else. "I can have you on a plane by morning," he said. "New city. New name if you want it. A position in one of my operations in Milwaukee, legitimate work, good salary, an apartment in a building with security that would take a tank to get through." He paused. "Or I can make him disappear tonight. Your choice." The room went very quiet. Kaylin stared at him, searched his face for the thing she always searched for, the lie, the angle, the hidden agenda that lived behind every offer anyone had ever made her. Adrian had started with offers too. Help with rent, a place to stay, protection from a world that scared her. Every gift had been a brick in the wall he was building around her. Why? She said. Why what? Why would you do any of this? You met me once, in a conference room, for 90 minutes. Roman didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those gray eyes that gave away nothing and everything simultaneously. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that didn't match the words. My mother's name was Elena. She was 31 when my father beat her to death in a kitchen in Cicero while I hid under the basement stairs. I was 9. I could hear everything, every sound, every time she hit the floor, every time she tried to get up, every time she stopped trying. He said it flat, factual, like reading a weather report from a decade ago. She called the police 4 times that year, told her sister twice, went to a shelter once, and every time, the system that was supposed to protect her sent her back to the man who was going to kill her because that's what systems do. They process. They don't protect. Kaylin couldn't breathe. Nobody saw her, Roman said. Everybody looked. Nobody saw. I promised myself that I would never look away again, that's why. And the other part, making him disappear? That's not altruism, that's personal. You don't even know him. I don't need to know him. I know what he is. I've known what he is since I was 9 years old, and I've spent every year since then building the kind of power that makes men like him cease to exist. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Kaylin had ever heard. Milwaukee, she said finally. I want Milwaukee. Something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment that she hadn't chosen the other option. Something closer to respect. Or recognition. The understanding that she was drawing a line, accepting help without accepting violence, and that the line mattered. Milwaukee, he confirmed, my people will handle the logistics. You won't go back to that apartment. Whatever you left behind will replace. Whatever legal steps need to happen will... Restraining orders, lease termination, employment transition. My attorneys will manage it. Your only job right now is to sleep. I haven't slept in 3 years. I know, he said. And the way he said it told her he meant it literally. That he recognized insomnia the way she recognized bruises. By the texture of the skin around the eyes, the micro tremors in the hands, the particular hollow quality that a voice takes on when the body behind it hasn't rested in so long that exhaustion has become structural. A woman appeared in the doorway, 50-ish, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing the expression of someone who had been through this before and had stopped being surprised by it without ever stopping being angry about it. Guest room is ready, she said. Roman stood. Greta will show you upstairs. There are clothes in the closet. Bathroom has everything you need. The door locks from the inside. That last detail. The door locks from the inside. He'd said it deliberately, precisely, because he understood that for a woman coming from where Kaylin was coming from, a lock on the correct side of a door was worth more than every luxury in the house combined. She followed Greta up a staircase wide enough for 4 people abreast, down a hallway with thick carpet that swallowed her footsteps, into a bedroom that was larger than the entire apartment she'd shared with Adrian. The bed was made with white sheets pulled tight. The window looked out over the back garden, where landscape lighting illuminated rows of trees standing like sentinels against the dark. The door had a deadbolt. She turned it, tested it, turned it again. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and shook for 45 minutes straight. She didn't sleep. But for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to pretend she was going to. Milwaukee appeared 2 weeks later like something from a dream she'd forgotten she could have. Roman's people moved with the efficiency of a military operation. A 1-bedroom apartment in the 3rd ward. Exposed brick, tall windows, a view of the river that shimmered with city light. The building had a doorman, security cameras on every floor, and a key fob elevator system that required clearance to reach her floor. Her name on the lease was real. Everything else about the arrangement existed behind layers of corporate entities and holding companies that would take a forensic accountant 6 months to untangle. The job was real too. Operations coordinator for a logistics company called Lakeshore Consolidated, which managed warehouse space and distribution networks across Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Kaylin's office was on the 4th floor of a renovated industrial building in Walker's Point, surrounded by people who were smart and busy and didn't ask personal questions because everyone in the company seemed to operate under an unspoken agreement that the past was a country nobody needed to visit. She was good at the work. She'd always been good at work. Work was the machine she could climb inside and operate and predict. The one environment where the rules stayed consistent and effort produced results, and nobody changed the terms of engagement mid-sentence. She managed supply chains, vendor contracts, equipment schedules. She flagged inefficiencies that saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in the first quarter. Her supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Dara Kovac, told her she was the best hire they'd made in 3 years. Kaylin almost believed her. But the bruises were still healing. Not the ones on her skin. Those faded in weeks, yellowing, and then disappearing like watercolors left in the rain. The other ones. The ones that lived in the part of her brain that jerked awake at 2 a.m. because she thought she heard footsteps. The ones that made her flinch when a man at the coffee shop reached past her for a napkin. The ones that made her check the deadbolt 3 times every night and sleep with her phone on the pillow and her shoes by the door, because 3 years of Adrian Cross had rewired her nervous system into a tripwire that stayed taut even when there was nothing left to trigger it. She started therapy. Not because she wanted to. The idea of sitting in a room and talking about feelings made her jaw clench, but because Greta, who turned out to be Roman's household manager and a former social worker, had left a business card on the kitchen counter of the new apartment with a note that said, "She's good. She doesn't ask you to forgive anyone." The therapist was named Joan, 60-ish, short gray hair, a face like a fist that had learned to relax. She didn't do platitudes. She didn't do breathing exercises. She sat in a chair with a legal pad and a pen, and she asked questions that felt like surgery, precise, painful, and necessary. "Tell me about the first time he hit you." "I don't remember." "Yes, you do." Kaylin stared at her. Joan stared back. Neither blinked. 7 months in, Kaylin said. "I burned dinner, chicken. The smoke alarm went off and he was on a work call and he backhanded me across the mouth. Then he apologized for 20 minutes straight and bought me flowers. And we had sex. And I told myself it was a one-time thing, because that's what you tell yourself when the alternative is admitting that the person you love is going to kill you." Joan wrote something down. "And the last time? Tuesday. He strangled me." "How close?" Kaylin touched her throat. The bruises were almost gone now, just a faint yellow shadow that only she could see. "Close enough that I saw lights. And then? And then I called a man I barely know who sent men to pick me up and move me to another state." Joan looked up from her pad. "Roman Viscari." Kaylin went still. "You know him?" "Kaylin, everyone in Milwaukee knows Roman Viscari. The question isn't whether I know him. The question is whether you know what you've gotten yourself into." Something cold moved through Kaylin's stomach. "He helped me." "I'm sure he did, and I'm sure there are women in this city who are alive because of him. But help from a man like Roman Viscari is like taking medicine that hasn't been FDA approved. It might cure you and it might kill you, and either way, you won't know which until it's too late." "What is that supposed to mean?" It means that your pattern, and you do have a pattern, Kaylin, we all do, is trading one form of dependency for another. Adrian controlled you with fear. Be very careful that you don't let someone else control you with safety. Kaylin didn't go back to Joan for 2 weeks after that. When she finally did, she didn't mention Roman, but she thought about him constantly. He called on Thursday evenings. Always Thursday. Always at 8. The conversations were brief and structured, like status meetings. How is the apartment? How is work? Do you need anything? She answered in kind. Fine. Good. No. The exchange lasted 4 minutes, sometimes 5. There was never small talk. Roman didn't do small talk. He communicated the way surgeons operate, with precision, economy, and zero wasted motion. But once, 3 weeks after she'd arrived in Milwaukee, the call went differently. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. "I'm not." Silence. Then, "I didn't sleep for 2 years after my mother died. I'd lie in bed in the foster home and I'd hear the house settling and I'd think it was him. Every creak, every pipe rattling, every car door in the street. My body wouldn't let me close my eyes because closing your eyes is the most dangerous thing you can do when you're not safe." Kaylin gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "It gets better," he said. "Slowly. In ways you won't notice until one morning you wake up and realize you slept for 6 hours and the first thing you think about isn't where the exits are." Did it get better for you? A pause, longer than his usual pauses. I learned to manage it. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. That was the first honest thing he'd ever said to her. Not the story about his mother. That had been honest too, but weaponized, deployed at the exact moment it would have maximum impact. This was different. This was a crack in the architecture of Roman Vescari, a tiny fissure that let light into a space he kept sealed, and Kaylin felt it the way you feel a match strike in a dark room. Sudden, warm, and impossible to ignore. She started wanting Thursday evenings. That was the first sign. 2 months in, the wanting became specific. She wanted to hear his voice. She wanted the 4 minutes to become 5, then 10, then 20. She wanted to ask questions that had nothing to do with apartments or work or logistics. She wanted to know what he looked like at midnight, when the mask came off, and whoever lived behind those gray eyes was allowed to exist without an audience. This terrified her. Because Joan was right. Her pattern was dependency. Her nervous system was wired to attach itself to the nearest source of stability, the way a drowning person grabs the nearest solid object, and she couldn't trust her own instincts because her instincts had led her to Adrian and kept her there for 3 years while he dismantled her piece by piece. She told herself Roman was a resource, a benefactor, a man who'd helped her because of his own trauma and his own agenda and whatever complex machinery drove someone to build an empire from the ashes of a childhood that should have destroyed him. She told herself the warmth she felt during those Thursday calls was gratitude, not connection. She told herself a lot of things. Then he came to Milwaukee. No warning, no Thursday call. Just Declan ringing her apartment buzzer at 7 on a Saturday morning, saying Mr. Vescari is downstairs. She looked like wreckage, hair unwashed, wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants. No makeup, which meant her face was exactly what it was. That 28 years old, sharp-featured, dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep would fully erase. A small scar above her left eyebrow from the time Adrian had shoved her into the bathroom doorframe. She almost didn't go down. Almost told Declan to say she was sick, she wasn't available, she needed notice before unannounced visits, because showing up without warning was a thing that Adrian used to do, and her body couldn't tell the difference yet between surprise and threat. But she went down. Roman was standing beside the SUV in the building's parking garage. Same still posture, same gray eyes. But something about seeing him outside the context of conference rooms and late-night phone calls made him more real and less manageable, like a photograph that had been flat on a screen suddenly becoming three-dimensional and stepping into the room. I should have called first, he said. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. Yes, you should have. He accepted that. No deflection, no excuse, no charm offensive. I'm looking at a property in Bayview. I want your assessment. The logistics, supply chain access, zoning flexibility, 2 hours of your time. It was a Saturday. She could have said no. She was allowed to say no now. That was the whole point of Milwaukee. The whole point of the new apartment and the new job and the deadbolt that locked from the inside. She was allowed to say no to anyone, including the man who had made all of it possible. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She showered in 8, dressed in 12, spent the last minute staring at herself in the bathroom mirror, trying to find the line between professional courtesy and something else. The line was blurry. She stopped looking. The property was a massive warehouse complex on the south side, empty, industrial, surrounded by overgrown lots and rusted fencing. Roman walked through it the way a general walks through territory he intends to conquer, measuring everything, touching walls and support beams, looking at ceiling heights and loading dock configurations with an eye that missed nothing. Kaylin found herself doing what she did best, analyzing, calculating, seeing the potential buried under the decay. She talked about truck access routes and railroad proximity and utility infrastructure and tax increment financing opportunities. And Roman listened to every word with the same intensity he'd shown in that conference room in Chicago, and somewhere in the middle of a sentence about freight logistics, she realized he was standing very close to her and she hadn't moved away. They ended up at a diner 3 blocks from the warehouse. Vinyl booths, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration, a waitress who called everyone Han, and didn't look twice at the man in the $4,000 jacket sitting across from the woman in Target jeans. You're smarter than anyone at Lakeshore knows, Roman said, flat, factual, the same tone he used for everything. They know I'm good at my job. That's not the same as knowing what you're capable of. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, slow, deliberate. I need someone to oversee the acquisition and development pipeline for the entire Midwest corridor: properties, logistics, zoning strategy, vendor management. The scope is 10 times what you're doing now. Kaylin's breath caught. That's not an operations coordinator role. No, it's not. You're talking about a director-level position. I'm talking about the person who runs the operational backbone of everything I'm building in this region. Salary, equity stake, full authority. You'd report to me directly. I've worked for you for 2 months. You've worked at a desk for 2 months. You've been doing this kind of thinking your entire career. The difference is, nobody gave you the room. She looked at him across the table. The fluorescent diner light was merciless. It showed the texture of his scars, the tiredness around his eyes, the way his jaw stayed permanently set in a line that suggested he was always, at some level, bracing for impact. He wasn't handsome. He was something more complicated than handsome. He was the kind of face you couldn't stop studying because it contained contradictions that didn't resolve. Violence and patience, coldness and grief, power and the memory of powerlessness. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. His eyes met hers, held. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you pulled me out of a stairwell, moved me across state lines, gave me a job, an apartment, and now you're offering me the keys to a regional empire. People don't do that." "I do." "Why?" "I told you why. You told me about your mother. That explains the rescue. It doesn't explain this." She gestured between them, at the table, the coffee, the diner, the 2 hours they'd spent walking through an empty warehouse talking about supply chains while the space between them grew smaller and more charged. "What do you want from me, Roman?" He looked at her for a long time. The diner hummed around them, grease popping on a grill, silverware clinking, the waitress laughing at something in the kitchen. Normal sounds, the sounds of a world that operated on simple transactions and straightforward desires. Roman didn't live in that world. Neither did she. Not anymore. "I want you to be the person you would have been if nobody had ever broken you," he said, "and I want to watch it happen." The words landed in her chest like something heavy and warm and terrifying. She took the job. She shouldn't have. Joan would have told her she shouldn't have. Her own survival instincts, scorched and battered but still functioning, tried to tell her she shouldn't have. But something in the way he'd said it, not as a command, not as a seduction, but as a simple declaration of intent, bypassed every warning system she had and spoke directly to the part of her that had been locked in a dark room for 3 years and was desperate, desperate, to believe that someone could open the door without expecting ownership in return. The new role consumed her. 18-hour days, properties across Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. Warehouse acquisitions, zoning negotiations, contractor management. She built systems from scratch, hired teams, implemented processes that turned chaotic operations into machinery that hummed. She was good. She was exceptional. And every week the scope expanded, and every week she expanded with it, becoming someone she didn't recognize in the bathroom mirror. Sharper, more certain, more willing to take space in a room instead of shrinking into corners. Roman watched from a distance. Thursday calls continued. He visited Milwaukee twice a month. Their meetings grew longer, more detailed, more charged with something that lived in the pauses between sentences and the moments when their eyes caught and held a beat too long. She didn't touch him. He didn't touch her. The space between them became its own kind of electricity. Contained, pressurized, waiting. Then, 4 months into Milwaukee, Kaylin found the file. She was reorganizing the financial records for a warehouse acquisition in Kenosha. Standard due diligence, title searches, environmental assessments, tax histories. But one of the shell companies on the title chain didn't match the records in Lakeshore's system. She traced it through 3 holding companies, 2 offshore accounts, and a trust registered in Delaware to a series of transactions that made no financial sense unless money was being moved through the property specifically to be cleaned. She pulled more files, different properties, different cities. The pattern was everywhere. Acquisitions purchased above market value, renovations billed at triple cost, vendor payments to companies that existed on paper and nowhere else, money flowing in dirty and coming out scrubbed and legitimate, washed through the infrastructure she had built, the infrastructure she managed, the operations she oversaw, every contract she had signed, every vendor she had approved, every acquisition she had processed. All of it was part of a machine designed to launder money through real estate. And Kaylin Mercer, the woman who had been rescued and relocated and promoted and empowered, was the mechanism that made it work. Her hands were shaking when she closed the laptop. Not the trembling of fear, something worse. The trembling of a person who has just realized that the ground beneath them was never solid, that every step they took was on a surface that someone else controlled, and that the freedom they thought they'd earned was just another room with a lock on the wrong side of the door. She picked up her phone, dialed the number she knew by heart now. It rang once. "Kaylin, tell me the truth." Her voice came out flat, dead. The voice of a woman who had already decided what the answer was and was just waiting for confirmation. "Tell me what I've been doing for the last 4 months." Silence. 3 seconds. 4. 5. She heard Roman exhale, and in that single breath she heard the answer before he spoke it. "Come to Chicago," he said. "We need to talk in person." "No, tell me now." "Kaylin, did you use me?" The silence that followed was so absolute she could hear the blood moving through her own ears. Outside her office window, Milwaukee sprawled gray and indifferent beneath a sky the color of old concrete. She stared at the city that was supposed to be her fresh start and felt it tilting beneath her, the angles going wrong, the horizon line shifting the way it shifts in the seconds before a building collapses. Everything still standing, but nothing still stable. Roman's voice came back, quiet, stripped of every layer of control she'd ever heard in it. "Yes." One word, one syllable, and every wall Kaylin had rebuilt in the last 4 months cracked from floor to ceiling. She was still holding the phone when a notification flashed across her laptop screen. A security alert from the building's front desk. Someone had bypassed the lobby system. Someone was in the elevator, ascending to the 4th floor, and the name on the override log was one she hadn't seen in months, but recognized the way your body recognizes the sound of a car backfiring. Not with your mind, but with your marrow. "Adrian Cross." The elevator chime sounded at the end of the hallway, and Kaylin realized with a clarity that tasted like metal on her tongue that every door she thought she'd walked through, away from Adrian, toward Roman, into freedom, into power, had led her to the exact same place. A room with no exit, and 2 men who had both decided she belonged to them. The elevator chime hung in the air like the last note of something dying. Kaylin's hand was still wrapped around her phone, Roman's voice still bleeding through the speaker. "Kaylin, listen to me." But she wasn't listening anymore. Her body had already taken over. 3 years of survival programming firing all at once, every nerve ending lighting up like a switchboard in a building that's about to lose power. She knew that sound. Not the chime itself, but what came after it. The particular weight of his footsteps. The way Adrian moved through space like he was pushing against something invisible, always leaning forward, always accelerating toward the thing he wanted to break. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on industrial concrete. The hallway outside her office was long and narrow, converted warehouse space with exposed ductwork overhead and polished floors that carried sound the way water carries a current. Each step got louder. Each step closed a distance she'd spent 4 months and 200 miles trying to build. Her thumb moved to end the call. Stopped. Roman was saying something. "Don't hang up. I'm sending Declan. He's 20 minutes out." And 20 minutes was a lifetime. 20 minutes was a novel. 20 minutes was longer than it had ever taken Adrian to do the worst thing he was capable of. She ended the call. The phone went into her jacket pocket. She stood up from the desk. Her chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a soft thud that sounded enormous in the silence. She looked around her office. The laptop with the money laundering evidence still glowing on the screen, the stack of contracts she'd signed with her own name, the framed operations schedule on the wall that she'd designed and implemented and been proud of, a monument to her own competence that was now a monument to her own blindness, and she understood with brutal clarity that there was nowhere to go. The office had one door, one window, but it was 4th floor and the glass was fixed, non-opening. The kind of industrial pane designed to let light in without letting anything out. Metaphor of her entire existence. She could lock the door. The lock was a standard commercial deadbolt, solid enough for normal circumstances, and nothing about Adrian Cross had ever been normal circumstances. She locked it anyway. Then she stepped back from the door and stood in the center of the room and waited. The footsteps stopped outside. 3 seconds of silence. She could hear him breathing through the door. That wet, heavy rhythm she knew from 1,000 nights of lying awake in the dark, calibrating the depth and speed of his breath to determine whether he was asleep or pretending, whether the monster was dormant or just waiting with its eyes closed. The door handle moved, slowly, tested, found locked. Kay, his voice. 4 months since she'd heard it, and her body responded before her mind could intervene. Shoulders pulling inward, chin dropping, hands pressing flat against her thighs. The flinch response. The posture of a woman making herself small because small targets get hit less. She caught herself doing it and forced her shoulders back, forced her chin up, forced her hands into fists at her sides, and the effort it took to override 3 years of conditioning made her teeth ache. Kay, open the door. How did you find me? A sound through the door, not quite a laugh. You think I ever lost you? I knew where you were 2 weeks after you ran. The building, the apartment, the job, all of it. I've been watching, baby. I've been patient. Her stomach dropped. The floor beneath her feet felt suddenly theoretical, like it might decide at any moment to stop being solid. 2 weeks. He'd known for nearly 4 months. Every night she'd checked the deadbolt 3 times. Every morning she'd walk to work scanning the street for his face. Every therapy session she'd spent unraveling the damage he'd caused, and he'd been there, somewhere, watching. Patient the way a trap is patient. Adrian, there's a restraining order filed in Cook County, Illinois. We're in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. Different jurisdiction. You want to call the cops? Go ahead. By the time they get here, we'll have talked, and I'll be gone. And it'll be your word against mine that I was ever here at all. He'd done research. That was new. Adrian didn't do research. Adrian operated on instinct and rage, and the kind of animal cunning that didn't require planning because it didn't require permission. The fact that he'd researched jurisdictions meant something had changed. Something had made him smarter, or desperate enough that desperation was functioning as intelligence. I don't want to talk to you, she said. Yeah, well, I didn't want to spend 4 months tracking you across state lines either, so I guess neither of us is getting what we want. A pause. Something shifted in his tone, dropped lower, got softer, found that register he used when the violence was over and the apologies began. I'm in trouble, Kay. Real trouble. The people I told you about, the money I owe, they're not waiting anymore. That's not my problem. It became your problem the second your new boyfriend decided to get involved. Kaylin went very still. What? Biscari. Yeah, I know about him. I know about all of it. The apartment he set you up in, the job, the whole rescue operation, real knight in shining armor stuff. The softness evaporated from his voice. What replaced it was something she hadn't heard before. Not rage, not self-pity, but a cold, calculated bitterness that sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this speech for months. You want to know something funny? The people I owe money to, the syndicate, they know Viscari too. They do business with him. Or they used to, until he started squeezing them out of territories they've held for 15 years. So now they've got 2 reasons to come after him, money and territory. And guess what connects all of it? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. You, Kay, you're the connection, the woman who left me to shack up with the guy who's been stealing their business. They don't just want money from me anymore. They want leverage. And you, sitting in your nice apartment, working your nice job, managing the operations that are washing his dirty money through every warehouse between here and Indianapolis, you're the best leverage anyone could ask for. The room tilted. Not physically. Something behind her eyes shifted, some internal gyroscope that had been keeping her upright through sheer mechanical stubbornness. And for a moment, the floor and the ceiling and the walls traded places, and she had to press her palm against the desk to keep from going down. You're lying, she said. But the words had no weight. She'd spent 3 years learning the topology of Adrian's lies, the inflections, the tells, the way his voice went smooth when he was fabricating and rough when he was telling a truth he wished he could bury. He wasn't lying. He was terrified. And Adrian Cross terrified was more dangerous than Adrian Cross angry, because fear removed the last restraint he had, which was the belief that he was in control. Open the door, Kay, please. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because if we don't figure this out together, they're going to kill both of us." She stood in the middle of her office with one hand on the desk and the other pressed against her thigh where her phone sat in her pocket. Roman's voice echoed in her head. Yes. One syllable. The admission that he'd used her. That the job, the apartment, the empowerment, the weekly phone calls, the warehouse in Bayview, the diner with bad coffee and good conversation, all of it was infrastructure. She was infrastructure. A logistics analyst repurposed as a laundering mechanism. The same skill set applied to a different kind of supply chain. And she'd been too grateful and too broken and too hungry for something that felt like freedom to see the architecture of her own exploitation. And now Adrian was outside the door telling her the exploitation went even deeper than she knew. That she wasn't just a tool in Roman's empire, but a target in someone else's war. That the two men who had shaped her adult life, one with fists and one with opportunity, had both been operating on the same fundamental assumption. That Kaylin Mercer was something to be used. She unlocked the door. Not because she trusted Adrian. Not because she'd forgiven him. Not because she believed for 1 second that his presence on the other side of that door was motivated by anything other than self-preservation. She unlocked it because the door had already stopped mattering. Because every locked door in her life had eventually opened, and the person who opened it was never the person she wanted it to be. Adrian stood in the hallway looking like something the city had chewed up and considered spitting out, but decided to keep chewing. He'd lost weight, maybe 20 pounds, enough to make his cheekbones sharp and his eyes too large for his face. His clothes were wrong, a jacket that didn't fit right, jeans that were dirty at the knees, shoes that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The handsome architecture of his face had collapsed into something gaunt and frantic, and his hands were shaking, not with rage, but with the kind of tremor that comes from sustained chemical intake. Alcohol, maybe pills, maybe both, and sustained terror. He looked at her the way a man looks at a lifeboat. "Don't touch me," she said. "Don't come in. Talk from there." He nodded, leaned against the door frame. His eyes moved past her to the office, scanning it the way he scanned every room, cataloging exits and angles and objects that could be weapons, a habit she now recognized as something they shared, something the damaged learned to do the way other people learned to breathe. "The syndicate is called the Moretti family," he said. "Salvatore Moretti runs it. Old school, brutal. They've been controlling gambling operations and loan distribution across the northern Midwest for 20 years. I got into their sports betting network through a guy I met at a bar. It was supposed to be small, 1,000 here, 2,000 there. Then I started losing, and they started lending, and the interest was 30% monthly, and by the time I understood what was happening, I was in for 300 and change. You told me this already, in the apartment. The night I tried to kill you." "Yeah." He said it without flinching, without the theatrical remorse he used to deploy like a weapon of its own, just flat acknowledgement. "I know what I am, Kay. I'm not here to pretend I'm something else." That stopped her. In 3 years, Adrian had never once described his violence without euphemism, without redirection, without the elaborate self-deception that allowed him to hit her and then explain why hitting her was actually a symptom of how much he loved her. This raw admission, "I know what I am," was either the most honest thing he'd ever said or the most sophisticated manipulation he'd ever attempted, and Kaylin couldn't tell which. And the inability to distinguish between the two was its own kind of torture. "After you left," he continued, "the Morettis increased pressure. They sent people to the apartment, not to collect, to demonstrate. They broke my hand." He held up his left hand. The ring finger and pinky were splinted with dirty tape, the skin around the splint mottled purple and yellow. "Then they told me they knew about you. They had photos, your new address, your building, your route to work. They said if I didn't deliver what I owed plus interest, they'd take you instead and use you to get to Viscari." "Use me how? How do you think?" His voice cracked. "You're living in his building, working in his company, handling his operations. You're either his woman or his asset or both. And either way, getting to you gets to him. They want territory back. They want the money I owe. And they want Viscari to bleed." Kaylin stared at him. The man who had strangled her stood 5 feet away with broken fingers and terror in his eyes, telling her she was a target in a war she didn't know existed. And the perverse geometry of the situation was that he was the only person in the last 24 hours who had told her the truth without being asked twice. "Why come here?" she said. "Why tell me?" "Because they gave me a choice. Deliver you or die. And I'm a lot of things, Kay, but I'm not—" He stopped, swallowed. His jaw worked around something he couldn't quite form into words. "I'm not going to hand you to someone worse than me." She almost laughed. The absurdity of it. The grotesque comedy of a man who had beaten her for 3 years, drawing a moral line at selling her to a crime syndicate, as if there were gradations of monstrosity that mattered, as if the fact that he'd chosen not to commit one particular atrocity somehow redeemed or reduced all the others. "You need to leave," she said. "Kay, now, before Roman's people get here. Because if Declan walks through that lobby and finds you standing at my door, you won't make it back to Chicago." Adrian's face changed. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, though that was there too, but a recognition of the territory she now occupied. She was speaking a language he understood. Threat, consequence, the calculus of violence. She was no longer the woman on the kitchen floor. She was someone who knew what Declan was capable of and used that knowledge as leverage. And Adrian saw it. And what he felt in that moment was visible on his ruined face like weather on a plane. Shock, grief, and something that might have been respect if he were capable of respect that didn't curdle into possession. "Be careful with him," Adrian said. He pushed off the doorframe, took a step back into the hallway. "Viscari, I know you think he saved you. Maybe part of him did, but I talk to people. People who've worked for him, people who've crossed him. He doesn't protect people because he's good, Kay. He protects people because it makes him feel like he's not his father. And the day you stop serving that purpose, the day you become a problem instead of a project, you'll find out what he really is." He turned and walked down the hallway. She listened to his footsteps recede, heard the elevator chime, heard the doors close, heard silence fill the space where he'd been like water filling a hole. She closed her office door, locked it, sat down at her desk, stared at the laptop screen where the evidence of Roman's money laundering operation glowed in neat columns and carefully disguised transaction chains. Her phone rang. Roman. She let it ring. 4 times, 5, 6. Then she answered. "Declan is 8 minutes out," Roman said. His voice was different now. Tighter, faster. The composure cracked in places she'd never heard crack before. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Did he touch you?" "No." "What did he say?" "He said a lot of things. Most of them were true." She paused. Let the silence stretch. Let him sit in it. "He told me about the Moretti syndicate. He told me I'm a target. He told me the work I've been doing for you doesn't just wash money. It puts me in the crosshairs of a war you've been fighting for years." Silence from Roman. She could almost hear him recalculating, the way you can almost hear a machine adjusting gears when the load changes. "Come to Chicago," he said. "Tonight. I'll explain everything." "You had 4 months to explain everything. You chose to let me sign contracts and manage operations and build your infrastructure without telling me that every spreadsheet I touched was part of a criminal enterprise. You don't get to explain on your schedule anymore." "Kaylin, I'll come to Chicago, but not tonight, tomorrow, on my terms. And when I get there, you're going to tell me everything. Every deal, every transaction, every operation, every body buried under every property I've helped you acquire. And if I find out you're still lying, even about one thing, I'm going to the FBI with everything I've got." The silence that followed was enormous. She could feel his presence through the phone the way you can feel weather changing, a shift in pressure, a heaviness in the air that precedes something catastrophic. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "I'll send a car. I'll drive myself." She hung up, sat alone in her office while the Milwaukee sky darkened outside the window and the building emptied around her, and the last light of the day bled out across the river in colors that looked like bruises fading. At 9 o'clock, she opened the laptop again. She spent 4 hours copying files, every transaction record, every shell company trace, every contract with her signature on it, every vendor payment that went to a company that didn't exist. She put them on 2 encrypted drives, one for herself, one for a safe deposit box she'd open in the morning at a bank that had no connection to Roman Viscari or Lakeshore Consolidated or any entity in his constellation of influence. It was the first time in her life she'd built something for herself that wasn't a wall or a lie or a survival mechanism. It was leverage, real leverage. The kind of power that didn't depend on a man's goodwill or a locked door or the ability to make herself small enough to avoid a fist. She drove to Chicago the next morning in a rental car she paid for with cash. 3 hours on I-94 through flat gray farmland under a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain or not. She didn't listen to music, didn't listen to podcasts, didn't listen to anything except the engine and the road and her own breathing, steady and deliberate. The breathing of a woman who was walking into something she might not walk out of and had decided to walk in anyway. Roman's Chicago estate looked different in daylight. Smaller somehow. Less mythic. Just a big stone house behind a big stone wall with cameras and men in dark jackets, and the kind of manicured grounds that whispered money so loudly you could hear it from the street. Declan met her at the gate. Didn't speak. Led her through the front door, across the foyer, past the study where Roman had first offered her a new life, and up a staircase to a second-floor office she hadn't seen before. Bigger than the study. Windows on 3 sides. A desk the size of a small car, covered in papers and screens, and the debris of a man who ran an empire that was eating him alive. Roman stood by the window. He turned when she entered, looked at her. And for the first time since she'd known him, he looked uncertain. Not afraid. Roman Vescari didn't do afraid in any way she could read, but uncertain, as if the script he'd been following had suddenly gone blank and he was standing on a stage in front of an audience without any idea what his next line was supposed to be. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." He accepted that, nodded once, moved to the desk and placed both hands flat on its surface, fingers spread, like a man trying to hold something down. "Ask," he said. "How much of what I've been doing is legitimate? 60%, maybe 65. And the rest? Money movement, revenue from operations that don't appear on any official ledger. Gambling, protection fees, some narcotics distribution, though I've been pulling out of that for 3 years. Through my contracts, through my logistics systems." Yes, the word landed between them like a body falling from a height. Kaylin felt the impact in her chest, not pain, not surprise because she'd already known, but a kind of seismic finality, the sensation of the last small piece of denial crumbling and leaving nothing between her and the full scope of what had been done to her and what she had unwittingly done. "Did you plan this from the beginning?" she said. "From the conference room?" Roman's hands pressed harder against the desk. She watched his knuckles go white. "No, the conference room was real. What I saw in you was real. The decision to bring you into the operation came later, after you were already in Milwaukee. I needed someone with your skill set, someone who could build systems that looked legitimate because the person building them believed they were legitimate. So you needed me ignorant. I needed you effective. The ignorance was..." He stopped, closed his eyes. When he opened them, something behind the gray had shifted, not softened, but stripped, like paint coming off a surface to reveal whatever was underneath. "The ignorance was the part I told myself didn't matter. I was wrong." "You were wrong." She repeated it back to him flat, toneless, the way you'd repeat a diagnosis. "You used a woman who came to you broken and desperate, and you exploited her skills and her trust and her need to feel competent and safe. You did exactly what Adrian did, Roman. You just used a nicer room." The words hit him. She watched them hit, watched the impact travel through his body like a shockwave. His jaw clenched, his shoulders pulled back, the muscles in his forearms tightened until the scars stood out white against the skin. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't deflect. He stood behind his desk and absorbed it the way a wall absorbs a blow. And what she saw in his face was not the composed mask she'd studied for months, but something raw and terrible underneath. The face of a boy who'd hidden under basement stairs and sworn never to become his father, and had become something else instead. Something he was only now recognizing had its own kind of cruelty. "I have copies of everything," she said. "Every transaction, every shell company, every contract. It's encrypted and stored in locations you don't control. If anything happens to me, anything, it goes to federal prosecutors." Roman nodded slowly. "I'd expect nothing less." "This isn't a compliment. This is a threat. I know what it is. They stared at each other across the desk. The sunlight through the windows was cold and white, and it made the room feel like an operating theater. Sterile, exposed, every surface reflective and hard. Two people standing in the wreckage of a thing that might have been real if it hadn't been built on a foundation of lies, and neither of them willing to look away first. "What do you want?" Roman asked. Quiet. The quietest she'd ever heard him. "I want to know if the Moretti threat is real." "It's real." "How real?" "Salvatore Moretti has been expanding north for 5 years. I've been pushing back for 3. 6 months ago, he lost a major distribution corridor that ran through Kenosha, a corridor that my operations, your operations, replaced. He lost revenue. He lost face. He's old school. For men like him, losing face is worse than losing money. In Adrian's debt, 100,000 was real. The rest was manufactured. Moretti's people inflated it to create leverage. Adrian was never going to pay it off because he was never supposed to pay it off. He was supposed to lead them to you, and you were supposed to lead them to me. Kaylin's breath stopped. The room receded. She was standing in the middle of a web that had been woven around her by men on every side. Adrian, Roman, Moretti, each of them pulling different threads, each of them treating her as a means to an end, each of them so focused on their own war that the woman at the center of it had been reduced to a coordinate on a map, a piece on a board, a variable in an equation designed by people who had never once asked her what she wanted. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She looked at it. A photo. Her apartment building in Milwaukee. Her window, lit from inside by the lamp she'd left on, a habit she'd developed because coming home to a dark apartment triggered the same panic response as coming home to Adrian in a dark room. The photo was taken from the street, taken tonight. The timestamp was 40 minutes ago. Below the photo, 3 words. "We see you." She showed Roman the phone, watched the color leave his face, watched his hand move to the desk drawer and come out with a phone of his own, already dialing, already issuing orders in a voice that had gone flat and mechanical, the voice of a man shifting from human to operational in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Pull the Milwaukee team in, full perimeter on the estate. Get Dara out of the Walker's Point building. Sweep Kaylin's apartment. Don't enter, just thermal scan and report." He hung up, looked at her. "You can't go back to Milwaukee." "I figured that out." "You'll stay here. The estate has—" "I'm not staying in your house, Roman. This is not the time for— There's no time that's right for me to move into the house of a man who just admitted he used me as a money laundering tool. I'll find a hotel." "You'll be dead in a hotel." The sentence hung in the air between them, blunt and ugly and true. Kaylin looked at him, and he looked at her. And the math was simple and merciless. She couldn't go back to Milwaukee because Moretti's people were there. She couldn't go to a hotel because Moretti's people would find her. She couldn't go to the police because the police would find the money laundering and she'd go to prison. She couldn't go to the FBI because Roman had enough influence to bury her before the indictment was written. She couldn't go home to her mother in Bloomington because leading these people to her mother's door was a death sentence for a woman whose only crime was calling every Sunday and believing every lie. Every exit was locked. Every road led backward. Every choice she'd made, leaving Adrian, trusting Roman, building operations, copying files, had narrowed the world around her until she was standing in a space exactly the size of her own body, with no room left to move in any direction. Roman came around the desk, stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the pulse in his throat, hammering faster than his voice suggested, betraying the fear that his face refused to show. "I know you don't trust me," he said. "You shouldn't. I've earned that. But Salvatore Moretti doesn't want money and he doesn't want territory. He wants to send a message. And the message he wants to send involves you in a room with men who will make Adrian Cross look like a minor inconvenience." Her hands were shaking again. Not the trembling of a woman being offered help, the trembling of a woman standing at the edge of something she couldn't come back from. The woman who had hidden bruises and signed contracts and counted seconds in stairwells and built logistic systems and walked through every door that had been opened for her by men who always had their own reasons. That woman was being asked to make one more choice. One more leap into the arms of a man who had already dropped her once. "If I stay," she said, "it's not as your project, not as your asset, not as the woman you saved so you could feel less like your father. If I stay as someone who has the power to destroy you, and has chosen not to. Yet, Roman looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never seen there before. Not respect, not desire, not the cold calculation of a man measuring the utility of the person in front of him. She saw fear, real fear. The fear of a man who had spent his entire life making sure he never needed anyone and was now standing in front of the one person whose absence would leave a wound he couldn't manage or control or strategize around. "Okay," he said. One word, the same weight as the yes that had shattered her 24 hours ago, but aimed in the opposite direction. A surrender that was also an admission, that was also a beginning. Somewhere below them, in the bowels of the estate, a phone rang. Then another. Then voices, low and urgent, the sound of an operation mobilizing. Declan appeared in the doorway with a face that had turned to stone. Milwaukee Warehouse, Kenosha Distribution Center. Both hit in the last 15 minutes, incendiary devices. The Kenosha building is fully engulfed. 3 of our people are unaccounted for. Roman moved past Kaylin toward the door. She watched him go. Watched the man who'd been standing in front of her with fear in his eyes transform in 3 steps into someone else entirely. Colder, harder, every trace of vulnerability sealed behind the mask that had kept him alive for 30 years. He stopped at the doorway, looked back at her. "This is war now," he said. "You can still leave. But if you stay past tonight, there's no going back to what you were." Kaylin thought about the woman in the bathroom at 5 in the morning, pressing concealer into bruises. She thought about the woman in the stairwell, counting seconds. She thought about the woman at the desk, discovering the lies hidden in her own spreadsheets. She thought about every version of herself that had been built by other people's decisions, shaped by other people's violence, defined by other people's needs. She was so tired of being the thing that happened to. "I'm not leaving," she said. And the woman who said it was not the woman who had walked into that room 10 minutes ago. Something in her voice had changed, dropped lower, gone still, shed the last remnants of the tremor that had lived there since the first time Adrian raised his hand. It was the voice of a woman who had looked at every option and found them all poisoned and had decided, with a clarity that felt like ice forming on the surface of deep water, that if every choice led to destruction, she would at least choose which destruction and who would pay for it. Declan looked at Roman. Roman looked at Kaylin. And in that look, the last part of the old Kaylin Mercer, the invisible woman, the logistics analyst, the victim, the project, the asset, burned away and left something behind that neither man had anticipated and neither man could control. Something with teeth. The Kenosha warehouse burned for 11 hours. Kaylin watched the footage on a security monitor in Roman's basement operations room, a space she hadn't known existed until Declan led her down 2 flights of stairs behind a bookshelf that swung open on hydraulic hinges like something out of a fever dream. The room was concrete walls, fluorescent strips, 6 screens mounted in a grid, and a communications array that looked like it belonged in a military installation. 3 men sat at terminals wearing headsets, voices low, data streaming across their screens in columns of light. On the center monitor, the Kenosha building was a column of orange and black rising into the night sky. The steel frame warped and buckled in real time, sagging inward like a ribcage collapsing. Fire trucks ringed the perimeter, but the firefighters had pulled back. The structure was too far gone, the heat too intense, the accelerant too embedded in the foundation for water to matter. Roman stood behind the operators with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a tone Kaylin had never heard from him before. Not the flat calm of conference rooms, not the quiet control of late-night phone calls. This was operational. Clipped, rapid, devoid of any syllable that didn't carry tactical weight. He was issuing orders to people in at least 3 different locations, and the orders were about evacuation routes, and asset relocation and personnel extraction. And some of the words he used were words Kaylin recognized from logistics, containment, redundancy, corridor, repurposed for a context that had nothing to do with supply chains and everything to do with survival. 3 people were missing from the Kenosha site. By midnight, 2 were found. 1 in a hospital with second-degree burns across his back and arms. 1 in a parking lot 6 blocks away, disoriented, dehydrated, alive. The 3rd was confirmed dead at 2:14 a.m. A man named Paul Resnick, 43 years old, married, 2 children. He'd been in the warehouse's eastern wing when the incendiary device detonated and the fireball traveled through the ventilation system faster than legs could carry a body to the nearest exit. Kaylin didn't know Paul Resnick, had never met him, but she'd signed the staffing allocation form that placed him in the Kenosha facility 3 months ago. Her signature, her system, her logistics. She'd put a man in a building, and the building had killed him, and the signature on the form that put him there was written in her handwriting. She went to the bathroom on the first floor of the estate and vomited until her stomach was empty, and then kept going, dry heaving over the toilet with her hands braced against the porcelain and her body trying to expel something that couldn't be expelled because it wasn't physical. It lived deeper than her stomach. It lived in the place where guilt and complicity and horror converge into a single sensation that has no name, because language wasn't designed for the feeling of realizing you helped build the machine that killed someone. When she came out, Roman was in the hallway. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke. The fluorescent light in the corridor was harsh and unforgiving, and it showed everything. The exhaustion cratering his face, the blood that had dried at the corner of his mouth, where he'd been biting the inside of his cheek, the way his left hand trembled at his side in a rhythm he couldn't control. A tremor born not of weakness, but of adrenaline overload. A body running on chemicals that were never meant to sustain consciousness for this long. Paul Resnick, she said. I know. He had kids. 2 girls, 8 and 5. Because of me. Because of Moretti. Because of a building I staffed, a schedule I designed, a system I built for you, for your operation, for money that came from... Stop. Not a command. A request. The first time she'd ever heard Roman Vescari make a request. If you carry every death on your back, you won't be able to stand up. And I need you standing. You need me. Yes. For what? More operations? More logistics? More clean-looking spreadsheets over dirty money while people burn alive in buildings with my name on the paperwork? Roman's jaw tightened. The tremor in his hand intensified. He pressed his palm flat against the wall to still it, and the gesture was so human, so involuntarily vulnerable, that it cut through her rage like a blade through paper. I need you, he said, because you're the only person in my life who sees me clearly enough to say what you just said. Everyone else either fears me or needs me or both. You're the first person in 20 years who's looked at me and told me what I actually am, and I need that, not for the operation, for me. Kaylin stared at him. The hallway was narrow and quiet, and they were standing 3 feet apart, and the distance felt like miles and inches simultaneously. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to hold him. She wanted to scream in his face and ask him how a man who had watched his mother die could grow up to build an empire that killed other people's fathers. She wanted to understand how trauma could make someone both compassionate and monstrous, how the same wound could produce a man who rescued women from stairwells and laundered money through warehouses and looked at her with eyes that contained both tenderness and calculation in quantities she couldn't measure. Paul Resnick's family, she said. What happens to them? They'll be taken care of, financially, permanently. His wife will never work again unless she wants to. His girls will have everything they need through college and beyond. Blood money. Yes, and it's the only money that exists in my world. So it's blood money or nothing. Which do you want me to offer them? She didn't answer, couldn't, because the moral architecture of her life had been demolished so thoroughly in the last 48 hours that she no longer had a framework for distinguishing right from wrong, only degrees of wrong, and the distance between those degrees was shrinking by the hour. She slept for 3 hours on a couch in the study. Not real sleep, the shallow, fragmented kind where the body shuts down in self-defense while the mind continues running scenarios, replaying the footage of a burning building, calculating the weight of a dead man's name on a staffing form. When she woke, gray light was pushing through the curtains, and the house was alive with controlled chaos. Phones ringing, footsteps in hallways, the low murmur of men discussing violence in the language of logistics. Declan briefed her at 7 a.m. Not because Roman asked him to, because she demanded it. 3 coordinated hits overnight, he said. They were in the kitchen, enormous, industrial, stainless steel and marble. The kind of kitchen designed for catering events that served 100 people. Declan sat at the island with a tablet and a cup of coffee that he hadn't touched. Kenosha Warehouse, Milwaukee Distribution Center, minor damage, incendiary failed to fully ignite. and a restaurant in Chicago, Lincoln Park. Roman's accountant was having dinner there with his wife. Car bomb in the parking structure. He survived. His wife is in intensive care with spinal injuries. The accountant's wife, Margaret Doyle, 56, retired teacher. Kaylin pressed her palms flat on the marble countertop. The stone was cold. She needed the cold. Needed something solid and sharp against her skin to keep her tethered to the physical world, because the information Declan was delivering had the quality of something happening on a screen, something distant and unreal. And if she let it stay unreal, she would lose the ability to respond to it, and responding was the only thing she had left. What's Roman's plan? Declan looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not hostility, not dismissal. Something closer to evaluation. The look of a man who'd worked for Roman Vescari for a decade and had never seen a civilian sit at this table and ask that question with that tone of voice. Contain, reinforce, retaliate. Specifics. That's above your... Nothing is above my clearance anymore. I signed the contracts. I built the systems. A man died in my facility. I'm in this, Declan, all the way to the bottom, and if you shut me out of the planning, I'll go find the information myself, and I won't be gentle about how I get it. Declan studied her for 5 seconds. Then he unlocked his tablet and turned it toward her. The screen showed a map. Chicago and Milwaukee, connected by a network of lines and nodes. Properties, warehouses, distribution points, safe houses, legitimate businesses, and illegitimate operations, all laid out in a grid that looked exactly like the logistics networks Kaylin had built, because they were the logistics networks she'd built, repurposed now for war. Moretti's operation is headquartered in a compound outside Antioch, Declan said. 40 acres, fenced, guarded, cameras on every approach. He runs his northern operations from there, gambling, loan distribution, enforcement. His inner circle is 8 men. His security detail rotates in 12-hour shifts, 6 men per shift, all armed, most former military. What about law enforcement? Moretti has relationships with local PDs in Lake County and parts of Kenosha County. State police are unreliable. FBI has been building a case on him for 3 years, but they're understaffed, and Moretti's attorneys are better than theirs. So he's untouchable through legal channels. Effectively. And Roman's approach? Declan paused. The kind of pause that carries weight. Roman wants to take the compound, eliminate Moretti, dismantle the operation at the source. Take the compound meaning what? Meaning take the compound. The words sat between them on the marble countertop like something that had been placed there deliberately, carefully, the way you place a weapon on a table, not as a threat but as a fact, an object that exists and must be dealt with regardless of how anyone feels about it. When? Kaylin asked. Roman wants 72 hours to position assets. Intelligence, personnel, equipment. 72 hours is too long. Moretti hit 3 targets in one night. If he knows we're regrouping, he'll hit again before we're ready. Declan looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. The evaluation completed, the results filed, a conclusion reached. He nodded once. Tell Roman, he said, and it was the first time she'd heard him say those words to anyone who wasn't already part of the inner circle. She found Roman in the basement operations room. He'd been there all night. His shirt was wrinkled, sleeves still pushed to his elbows. The scars on his forearms visible under the fluorescent light like a map of everything he'd survived. He was standing behind one of the operators, watching data scroll across a screen, and when Kaylin walked in, he turned to her with eyes that were bloodshot and burning and alive in a way she'd never seen. The eyes of a man who had been pushed to the edge of his own control and was holding on with everything he had. 72 hours is too long, she said. I need time to... You need time he won't give you. He hit 3 targets in one night, Roman. 3. Coordinated. Simultaneous. That's not intimidation, that's a campaign. He's already moving to the next phase, and if you spend 3 days positioning assets, he'll burn through every piece of infrastructure we have left. We. She heard the word land, heard what it meant to him, watched his eyes change, not soften, never soften, but shift, recalibrate, incorporate a new variable into the equation he was constantly running behind those gray irises. We, she confirmed, because I built the systems he's destroying and I know their architecture better than anyone in this room, including you. I know which properties are critical and which are expendable. I know which supply chains can absorb disruption and which will collapse if they lose a single node. I know the logistics of your empire because I designed the logistics of your empire. And if you want to protect what's left of it while you go after Moretti, you need someone managing the operational backbone who can keep it running under combat conditions. Roman stared at her. The room was quiet, except for the hum of electronics and the distant rattle of the HVAC system pushing air through the concrete bunker. You're not trained for this, he said. I'm trained for exactly this. Everything I've done for the last 4 months has been crisis logistics under pressure. The only difference is the nature of the crisis. The difference is people die. People already died. Paul Resnick died. Margaret Doyle is in a hospital bed. How many more die while you spend 72 hours being careful? The operator nearest them turned in his chair and looked at Roman with an expression that said, "She's right, and we both know it." And Roman saw the look, and his jaw worked and his hands opened and closed at his sides in a rhythm that Kaylin recognized because it was the same rhythm her own hands made when she was fighting the urge to do something she couldn't take back. 48 hours, he said. I can compress the timeline to 48. 36. That's not 36 hours, Roman. I'll have the operational infrastructure secured and redundancy protocols activated within 24. You use the remaining 12 to position your assault team. We hit the compound at dawn on Thursday. The room went very still. Roman looked at her the way you look at something you thought you understood and are now seeing for the first time. Not the woman from the stairwell. Not the logistics analyst from the conference room. Not the project he'd rescued or the asset he'd deployed or the lover he'd been circling for months with the cautious gravity of a man who didn't trust himself to get close without causing damage. Something new. Something that had been forged in the fire of the last 48 hours. Out of betrayal and revelation and grief and rage and the absolute bone-deep refusal to be passive one more second in a life that had been defined by passivity. 36 hours, he said. She spent those 36 hours becoming someone she didn't recognize. She mapped every remaining asset in Roman's network. 13 properties across Wisconsin and Illinois, 8 active operations, 47 employees who knew varying degrees of the truth about what they were working for. She categorized them by vulnerability, which could be attacked, which could be abandoned, which were essential and needed fortification. She rerouted supply chains, redirected cash flows, built communication protocols that would allow the remaining operations to function even if 3 more sites were hit simultaneously. She worked 22 hours straight, 8 standing up, slept in 40-minute intervals on the couch in the operations room, showered once, standing under water so hot it turned her skin red, and when she looked at herself in the steam-clouded mirror, she saw a face she'd never seen before, harder, thinner, the dark circles under her eyes no longer signs of exhaustion, but markers of something else. Something that lived between determination and desperation, and didn't have a name yet because the woman wearing it hadn't existed long enough to name herself. On the second day, Roman found her in the operations room at 4 a.m. She was sitting at a terminal, cross-referencing property records with Moretti's known operational patterns, trying to predict which sites he'd hit next so she could evacuate personnel before the incendiaries arrived. Her eyes burned. Her hands cramped. The coffee in her cup had gone cold hours ago, and she'd stopped noticing. Roman pulled a chair beside her, sat down. Didn't say anything for a long time, just sat there in the blue light of the monitors, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, and the proximity did something to the air between them, charged it, weighted it, made the silence between them feel like a conversation that was happening in a language neither of them had learned to speak out loud yet. "You should sleep," he said. "You should have told me the truth 4 months ago." "Yes. Then we'd be having a different conversation right now." "What conversation would that be?" She turned to look at him. His face was close, inches. She could see the grain of stubble along his jaw, the faint scar that ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, a scar she'd never noticed before, or maybe had noticed and filed away in the growing catalog of damage she was building around this man. An atlas of violence received and violence survived. "I don't know," she said, "but it wouldn't involve 36-hour countdowns and assault teams." "Maybe not." He paused. "Or maybe it would. Maybe this was always where it was going. Maybe 2 people who were built the way we were built don't get to have the other kind of conversation." "What kind is that?" the kind where nobody's bleeding. She felt something crack in her chest. Not break, crack. The way ice cracks on the surface of a lake in early spring, the fracture spreading outward in lines that are invisible until the whole surface gives way and the water underneath rushes up. She felt it rushing up now, everything she'd been holding back since the stairwell, since the conference room, since the first Thursday phone call when his voice had made her want things she'd sworn she'd never want again. After this is over, she said, after Moretti, after the war, if we survive, I need you to tell me one true thing. What thing? Whether any of it was real, not the operation, not the strategy, not the empire. Whether what happened between us, the conversations, the silences, the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. Whether any of that was real or whether it was all just another system you built to keep me where you needed me. Roman looked at her. The monitors cast blue light across half his face and left the other half in shadow, and the division was so precise it looked intentional. One side illuminated, one side dark, the two halves of a man who had spent his life trying to reconcile the violence he'd inherited with the tenderness he'd been too afraid to trust. It was real, he said. All of it. That's the part that scares me. Why? Because I can manage everything else. The empire, the war, Moretti, the FBI. All of it runs on logic and leverage and systems I understand. But this? He raised his hand, hesitated, then placed it against her face, his palm warm against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted everything his hands had ever been used for. This is the one thing I can't control, and I've spent my entire life making sure there was nothing I couldn't control. She leaned into his hand. 1 inch, 2, felt the warmth of his palm spread through her skin like something thawing. Then she pulled back. After, she said, we finish this first. He dropped his hand, nodded. The mask slid back into place, but imperfectly now, cracked at the seams, letting light leak through in places it had never leaked before. He stood up and walked out of the operations room, and she listened to his footsteps recede up the stairs, and she sat alone in the blue light and pressed her palm against the cheek where his hand had been and felt the warmth fading like a signal growing distant. Thursday dawn arrived cold and gray. At 4:47 a.m., Roman's assault team, 12 men in tactical gear, faces covered, communications encrypted, moving in 3 vehicles through the back roads of Lake County, reached the perimeter of Moretti's compound. Kaylin watched from the operations room via satellite feed and body camera footage, her hands flat on the table, her breathing controlled, her eyes tracking every movement on every screen. Roman was with the lead team. She'd argued against it. Declan had argued against it. Everyone had argued against it. Roman went anyway, because whatever machinery drove him, guilt, rage, the ghost of a mother who died on a kitchen floor in Cicero, that machinery required him to be present for the ending. He couldn't orchestrate this from a basement. He needed to be inside it, needed to feel it. Kaylin understood. She hated that she understood. But she did. The compound's outer fence was breached at 4:52. Cameras were looped, guard rotations exploited, motion sensors bypassed using intelligence that Kaylin had helped compile from property records and utility filings and building permits that most people wouldn't think to examine for tactical value, but that she'd read the way she read supply chain analyses, looking for patterns, weaknesses, the places where systems failed and gaps appeared. The first guard went down silently at 4:56, then the second, then the third. The body cameras showed it in fragments, dark figures moving through dark spaces, the metallic whisper of suppressed weapons, bodies dropping with a soft finality that made Kaylin's stomach clench, because each body was a person, and each person had a name and a life and a family, and she'd helped plan the operation that ended all of it. At 5:03, the assault team reached the main building, a sprawling ranch-style structure, single-story, brick and timber, built for privacy and defense, with reinforced doors and ballistic windows, and a security system that Roman's tech team had spent 36 hours learning to disable. At 5:04, everything went wrong. The front entry team triggered a secondary alarm that hadn't shown up on any schematic, a pressure sensor buried under the entryway tile, old technology, analog, not connected to the digital system they'd compromised. The alarm was a klaxon that shattered the pre-dawn silence and turned the compound from sleeping target to active combat zone in the span of 3 seconds. Kaylin watched it happen on the monitors, watched the compound light up, floods mounted on the roof blazing to life, turning the dark grounds into a white-lit killing field, watched doors fly open and men pour out of the bunkhouse on the east side, armed, moving with the disorganized ferocity of soldiers ripped from sleep and driven by pure adrenaline. Gunfire erupted. On the body camera feeds, the world became a strobing chaos of muzzle flash and shouting and the heavy staccato of automatic weapons tearing through the cold morning air. Kaylin's hands gripped the table edge so hard she felt the tendons in her wrists straining. Roman's camera feed showed him pressed against the exterior wall of the main building, weapon raised, his breathing rapid in the microphone. The first time she'd ever heard him breathe that way, fast and shallow and human, the breathing of a man who was not invulnerable and knew it. East team, suppress the bunkhouse. West team, breach the main structure. Now. Roman's voice on the comms. Commanding, but strained. Thinner than she'd ever heard it. The West team blew the side entrance. Flashbang grenades detonated inside the building, and on the camera feeds the interior became a whiteout of light and smoke. Roman entered behind the second man, moving fast, weapons sweeping doorways and hallways and corners with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before, who had been doing things like this for longer than Kaylin had known about, longer than she'd been building his supply chains and managing his properties and falling in love with a man who carried this kind of violence inside him like a second heartbeat, room by room, hallway by hallway. The main building cleared in segments, each room entered and secured, each doorway a potential ending. Outside, the firefight intensified. She could hear it through the body cameras, the distance muffled rattle of gunfire punctuated by single sharp cracks that meant someone had aimed and someone else had fallen. Then Roman's team reached the master bedroom at the end of the east corridor. The door was open. The room beyond was large, dimly lit by a single lamp on a bedside table. And Salvatore Moretti was sitting in an armchair by the window, fully dressed in a dark suit, legs crossed, a glass of something amber resting on the arm of the chair. He hadn't run, hadn't armed himself, hadn't moved from the spot where he'd apparently been waiting since before the assault began. He'd known they were coming. On the body camera, Kaylin saw Moretti look directly at Roman as he entered the room, saw the old man's face, 70-ish, heavy, deeply lined, with eyes that were almost black and a mouth that was curled into something that wasn't a smile but occupied the same space on a face. Roman Vescari. The voice was gravelly, accented, unhurried. You send 12 men to kill an old man in his own house. Your mother would be ashamed. Roman's camera went still. His breathing stopped for 1 beat. 2. 3. Then the feed erupted. Not gunfire. Movement. Something fast and chaotic. Roman lunging forward, then staggering. A sound. Sharp. Concussive. Close. A handgun. Moretti had a handgun, not in his hand where they could see it, under the cushion. A small caliber pistol fired from the hip, aimed at the torso, the shot muffled by the upholstery and the fabric of his suit. Roman's camera jerked downward. Kaylin saw the floor rushing up, saw the carpet pattern, dark burgundy, geometric, filling the frame. Heard a sound that was either static or breathing or both. Then the camera went sideways and the image settled at an angle that showed the ceiling and one wall and a spreading dark stain on the carpet that was visible even in the dim light. Blood. Roman's blood. Kaylin's hands left the table. Her body stood without her permission. Her mouth opened and a sound came out that she didn't recognize. Not a scream, not a word, something between the two. Something that had no language because the event it was responding to existed in a place beyond language. The operations room around her reacted. Voices on comms. Declan shouting orders into a headset. Operators typing rapidly, pulling up secondary feeds, trying to get visual confirmation on Roman's status. But Kaylin wasn't watching the operators. She was watching Roman's body camera, which was still transmitting from its sideways angle on the floor. And in that angle, she could see movement. Moretti, rising from the chair, standing over the fallen camera, standing over Roman, with the pistol now visible in his right hand, held at his side, loose, casual, the weapon of a man who had done this before and felt nothing about doing it again. And behind Moretti, in the doorway that the assault team had entered through, she could see a second figure. Tall, gaunt, shaking. Adrian Cross. He was standing in the doorway of Salvatore Moretti's bedroom, with a gun in his hands that looked too large for his grip, and his face was a ruin of terror and chemical derangement. And Kaylin understood with a clarity that split her skull like lightning that Adrian hadn't come to Milwaukee to warn her. He'd come to deliver her. And when that failed, he'd come here, to the compound, to the man who owned his debt, to prove his usefulness by being present for the kill. Moretti turned to Adrian, said something the camera's microphone didn't fully capture, something about finishing it, about proving himself, about debts being paid in specific currencies. Adrian raised the gun, pointed it at Roman on the floor. His hands were shaking so badly the barrel drew circles in the air. On the monitor, Kaylin watched the man who had beaten her for 3 years aim a weapon at the man who had saved her and used her in equal measure. And the two opposing forces of her life converged in a single frame. Violence and manipulation, fear and ambition, the fist and the contract, both pointing at a man bleeding on a burgundy carpet while she stood 200 miles away, watching it happen on a screen. She grabbed the comm headset from the nearest operator, jammed it onto her head, keyed the channel. "Declan, the bedroom, now!" Static. Then Declan's voice, winded, strained. "Pinned down. East corridor. 2 of Moretti's men. Roman is shot. Adrian Cross is in the room with Moretti. They're going to execute him." Silence. 1 second. An eternity compressed into a single heartbeat. On the screen, Adrian's finger moved to the trigger, and Kaylin made the decision that would end one life and begin another. She pulled the headset off, walked to the cabinet on the far wall where Declan kept the vehicle keys, took the keys to the armored sedan parked in the estate's garage, walked up the stairs, through the hallway, out the kitchen door, into the garage, started the car. The engine turned over with a sound like a heart restarting. She pulled out of the estate at 5:11 a.m. Antioch was 97 minutes north. She drove it in 53, the speedometer buried past 100 on empty pre-dawn highways, the car eating asphalt in the dark while the comm unit on the passenger seat crackled with voices she couldn't fully hear and didn't need to because the only voice that mattered was the one in her own head, the one that had been silent for 3 years and was now speaking with a clarity that felt like bone-breaking and reforming into something harder. She reached the compound at 6:04 a.m. The gate was open, blown open by the assault team, twisted metal hanging from its hinges like a broken jaw. She drove through without slowing, past the bunkhouse where bodies lay in the cold morning light, past the vehicle yard where bullet-pocked SUVs smoldered, up the gravel drive to the main building's shattered side entrance. She killed the engine, opened the glove compartment. Inside was a Glock 19 that Declan kept in every vehicle as standard protocol. She'd never held a handgun before. It was heavier than she'd expected and lighter than she'd feared, and the grip fit her hand with an intimacy that felt obscene. She got out of the car. The morning air smelled like cordite and something chemical, and underneath it all, the iron-sweet smell of blood, a smell she knew from bathrooms and kitchen floors and the back of her own throat, a smell that had once meant she was the one bleeding and now meant something entirely different. She walked into the building. The hallway was wrecked, drywall cratered, light fixtures hanging by wires, shell casings scattered across the floor like brass seeds. She stepped over debris and bodies and the remnants of a security system that had failed to protect anyone. Her socked feet from the stairwell were gone. She was wearing boots now. Roman's estate had a closet full of tactical gear, and she dressed without thinking, the way you dress for weather, the way you prepare for an environment that requires specific equipment to survive in. The master bedroom door was at the end of the hall, still open, light still spilling from inside. She could hear voices, Moretti's, low and measured, Adrian's, high and fractured, and underneath both of them, a sound that was either breathing or dying. She stopped outside the door, pressed her back to the wall, felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt, felt the Glock in her hand, the textured grip biting into her palm, the weight of it pulling her arm down like gravity had decided to focus its entire attention on this one object. She thought about Paul Resnick. She thought about Margaret Doyle. She thought about the woman in the bathroom mirror pressing concealer into bruises. She thought about every door she'd ever walked through and every man who'd been waiting on the other side. She stepped into the doorway. Moretti saw her first. His black eyes moved from Adrian to the woman in the doorway holding a gun she'd never fired. And what crossed his face was not fear, but something worse: amusement. The indulgent, contemptuous amusement of a man who had spent a lifetime watching people arrive at moments they weren't equipped for. Adrian turned, the gun in his hand swung toward her reflexively, then away, then back, then down. His body couldn't decide what she was: threat or refuge. The woman he'd beaten or the woman he'd come to deliver. And the confusion on his face was so total, it looked like a different kind of pain. Roman was on the floor between them, eyes open, hands pressed against his lower right abdomen where blood seeped between his fingers in dark pulses. He was conscious, breathing, watching her with those gray eyes that had seen her in a conference room, in a stairwell, in a diner, and an operations bunker, and were now seeing her in the doorway of a room where he was bleeding to death. And what she saw in those eyes was not surprise. He'd known she would come. Kaylin. Moretti's voice filled the room like smoke. The woman at the center of everything. I've heard so much about you. He gestured with the pistol. Casual, almost elegant. Please, come in. We were just deciding how this ends. She stepped into the room. The gun in her hand was steady. Her hands were not shaking. For the first time in her life, her hands were not shaking, and the absence of tremor frightened her more than any tremor ever had because it meant something inside her had changed at a level she couldn't reach or reverse. 3 people in a room, 2 guns, 1 man bleeding. And the woman who had spent her entire adult life being used by men was now standing at the center of it all, holding the only weapon that wasn't pointed at someone she cared about. And the choice before her was not a choice at all, but a transformation. The final, irreversible step across a line that separated the person she had been from the person she was about to become. Adrian looked at her. His eyes were streaming. His broken fingers trembled on the gun. "Kay," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Moretti smiled. Roman bled. And Kaylin raised the Glock and felt the trigger against her finger and understood, with a finality that tasted like iron and gunpowder and the cold morning air pouring through the shattered windows of a dead man's house, that the next 3 seconds would determine not just who lived and who died, but who she would be for every remaining second of her life. She fired. Not at Adrian, not at Moretti, at the lamp on the bedside table. The bulb exploded and the room plunged into half-darkness, lit only by the gray pre-dawn light bleeding through the shattered window. In the fraction of a second that followed, the fraction where Moretti's eyes flinched toward the sound, and Adrian's hands jerked reflexively, and the shadows reshuffled everything in the room like a deck of cards thrown into the air, Kaylin moved, not forward, sideways, dropping low, angling left, putting the heavy oak dresser between herself and Moretti's line of fire. She'd never been trained for this, but 3 years of living with a man who struck without warning had built reflexes that operated below the level of conscious thought, reflexes that measured angles and distances and reaction times the way other people's bodies measured temperature, automatically, instantly, without permission. Moretti fired. The bullet hit the dresser 6 inches from her head and sent splinters raking across her cheek like tiny claws. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a concussive crack that compressed the air and left her ears ringing with a high metallic tone that turned all subsequent sounds into something underwater. Adrian screamed. Not a word. A sound. The sound of a man whose nervous system had reached its absolute capacity and was now venting pressure the only way it knew how. Through the throat, through the mouth, through a vocal apparatus that had been built for language and was now being used for something more primitive. Through the ringing in her ears, Kaylin heard Moretti's voice, calm, amused, terrifyingly controlled. "You should have aimed at me, girl." She didn't respond. She was already moving again, crawling along the base of the dresser toward Roman, who lay 3 feet away with his hands still pressed against the wound in his abdomen and his eyes tracking her movement with a focus that suggested he was operating on willpower alone, his body shutting down in stages while his mind refused to follow. She reached him, pressed her hand over his. His blood was warm between her fingers, slick and constant, and the volume of it told her things she didn't want to know. That the bullet had hit something vascular, that the bleeding was internal as well as external, that the window between where they were and where he needed to be was measured in minutes, not hours. Can you move? She whispered. Not fast. His voice was a rasp. Thin, like paper tearing slowly. Moretti's got 4 rounds left. He's between us and the door. Adrian? Useless. He's frozen. She looked across the room. In the gray light, she could see Adrian standing exactly where he'd been when she'd entered. Back against the far wall, gun hanging at his side. His body locked in that particular paralysis that comes not from courage or cowardice, but from a system failure so complete that the body simply stops receiving instructions. His eyes were open, and they were looking at her, and they were seeing nothing. Moretti had moved. She couldn't see him clearly. The darkness and the furniture created a geography of shadows that shifted every time the light changed. But she could hear him, his breathing, the soft scrape of his shoes on the carpet, the mechanical click of a pistol hammer being thumbed back. Here's what's going to happen, Moretti said. His voice came from the left side of the room, near the window, moving. He was circling. Viscari bleeds out in the next 10 minutes, maybe 15 if his body decides to be stubborn. You girl, put the gun down and walk out of here and drive back to wherever you came from and forget that any of this happened. Adrian pays what he owes with labor, and we all pretend this little war never started. Kaylin's grip tightened on the Glock. The weapon felt different now. Not heavy, not light, just present. An extension of her hand, an object that existed in perfect contact with her palm and her fingers and the bones underneath. And the intimacy of that contact was the most honest physical relationship she'd had in years. No deception, no agenda, no hidden terms. Just metal and intention and the distance between where she was and where the bullet needed to go. No, she said. A pause. She heard Moretti's footsteps stop. No? No deal. No walking away. No pretending. A sound from Moretti, not quite a laugh. You've known Viscari for what, 5 months? 6? And you're willing to die on his floor for him? I'm not dying for him. I'm deciding for myself, for the first time. You don't get to understand that. Moretti resumed moving. She tracked the sound. He was circling toward the door, toward the exit, positioning himself with the tactical patience of a man who had survived decades in this business, by never being the one trapped in a room. But Kaylin knew rooms. She'd spent 3 years mapping the geometry of enclosed spaces. Every apartment she'd shared with Adrian had been a battlefield she'd memorized down to the last piece of furniture, the last shadow, the last angle where a body could hide or a fist could reach. She knew where the blind spots were. She knew how sound traveled in spaces with hard surfaces and soft carpeting. She knew that Moretti's voice was bouncing off the window behind him, which meant the window was within 2 feet of his position, which meant she knew exactly where he was, even though she couldn't see him. She raised the Glock over the edge of the dresser, didn't aim at where his voice was, aimed at the window behind his voice, the window that would reflect muzzle flash and show her his silhouette in the fraction of a second between firing and the bullet arriving. But she didn't fire. Not yet. Adrian? Her voice cut through the room like a blade through fabric. Look at me. No response. She could see his outline against the far wall, still frozen, still absent. Adrian, look at me. His head moved. Slowly. Mechanically. The way a machine moves when power returns after a blackout. Stuttering, uncertain, testing whether its own joints still work. You told me you came to warn me, she said. You told me you weren't going to hand me to someone worse than you. Was that true? Silence. Then, from the darkness against the wall, a sound that was almost a word. Yes. Then prove it. Right now. In the next 5 seconds. Prove you're something other than what you've always been. She watched his silhouette shift, watched his arm move, the arm holding the gun he'd been pointing at Roman before she entered the room. The gun that was now hanging at his side like something he'd forgotten he was carrying. Moretti's voice came sharp and fast. Don't be stupid, Adrian. You pull that trigger at me and my people will find your mother in Indiana within 24 hours. Kaylin felt the air in the room change, felt the temperature of Adrian's paralysis shift from frozen to molten, from locked to loaded, because Moretti had made a mistake. A tactical mistake. He'd threatened the one person Adrian Cross had never, in all his years of destruction, been willing to harm. His mother in Bloomington. The woman who called every Sunday. The woman who accepted every excuse. The woman who Adrian had been protecting from the truth of what he'd become with the same desperate energy that Kaylin had been using to hide bruises under concealer. Adrian's arm came up, not slowly, not with the shaking uncertainty of a man overwhelmed. Fast, sudden, the way his arm used to come up in apartments and kitchens and hallways. The explosive, unthinking speed of a man whose body knew violence, the way a pianist's hands know keys, automatically, without consultation. The motion already completed before the decision to make it had fully formed. He fired at Moretti's voice. The shot went wide, hit the wall 2 feet to the right of where Moretti stood, but it did what Kaylin needed it to do. It forced Moretti to move, to react, to shift his weight left toward the window, and in the muzzle flash of Adrian's shot, she saw him, a dark shape against darker glass. 2 feet from where she'd predicted. Close enough. She fired 3 times. The first shot hit the window frame. The second hit Moretti in the left shoulder and spun him sideways. The third hit him in the chest. Moretti staggered. His pistol went off. Reflexive, undirected, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. He took 1 step backward, then another. His back hit the window behind him, and the glass, already weakened by the assault team's earlier work, gave way with a sound like ice breaking, and Salvatore Moretti fell through the frame and landed on the frozen ground outside with a sound that was soft and final and terrible. The room went quiet. Not silent. Quiet. The kind of quiet that fills a space where violence has just been and hasn't fully left. The air still charged, the walls still ringing, the aftermath settling over everything like snow falling on a car wreck. Kaylin lowered the Glock. Her arms were shaking now. The steadiness that had possessed her for the last 60 seconds, the preternatural calm that had turned her into something she didn't recognize, drained out of her body like water through a cracked vessel, and what remained was a woman kneeling beside a bleeding man on a burgundy carpet with the smell of gunpowder in her hair and 3 bullet casings on the floor that she had put there. She pressed both hands against Roman's wound. "Stay awake. Declan is coming. Stay awake." Roman's eyes found hers, glazed, dimming, but present. "You came." "I drove 53 minutes at 112 miles an hour to get here. So yes, I came. Don't make me regret it by dying." The ghost of something that wasn't a smile moved across his face. The closest Roman Viscari had ever come to humor, and it happened while he was bleeding out on the floor of his enemy's bedroom. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. Then his eyes closed. Roman. His chest was still moving, shallow, rapid, but moving. She kept her hands pressed against the wound and she counted 1, 2, 3, 4, the way she'd counted in stairwells and on kitchen floors and in every dark space she'd ever occupied. The rhythm a tether, a rope thrown into the void, something to hold on to while the world tried to pull her under. Footsteps in the hallway. Running. Declan burst through the door with 2 men behind him, weapons drawn, faces tight with the controlled urgency of professionals encountering a situation that had exceeded all parameters. His eyes swept the room. Moretti gone through the window. Adrian slumped against the wall with his gun on the floor beside him, Roman unconscious on the carpet. Kaylin kneeling in a spreading pool of blood with her hands holding a man together through sheer pressure and willpower. "Medic!" Declan shouted. Then he was beside her, pulling a field kit from his vest, applying a compression bandage with the practiced speed of someone who'd done this in worse places under worse conditions. His hands replaced hers on the wound. She let go. Her fingers were dark red to the wrists. "Moretti?" Declan asked without looking up. "Through the window. I shot him 3 times. Declan's hands didn't pause. "Is he dead?" "If he's not, he should be." Declan sent a man to check. The man came back 45 seconds later and nodded once. Kaylin looked at Adrian. He was sitting on the floor now, legs spread, back against the wall, staring at his empty hands. The gun lay beside him where he'd dropped it, and the distance between his fingers and the weapon was maybe 8 inches, but it looked like miles, like the space between the person he'd been 30 seconds ago and the person he was now, and Kaylin understood that distance because she was living inside a similar one. "Adrian." He looked up. His face was wet. His broken fingers were cradled against his chest. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had just done the only decent thing he'd done in years and didn't know how to carry the weight of it. "Thank you," she said. He shook his head. Don't thank me." You made a choice. I made a choice that should have been easy, and it took me 31 years to make it. That's not something you thank a person for. That's something a person carries. He looked at the blood on the carpet, at Roman's still face, at the shattered window where Moretti had fallen through. Then he looked back at her. I loved you, Kay. I know that doesn't mean anything coming from me. I know what I did to you, but I loved you. Badly. The worst way a person can love someone. But it was real. I know it was real, she said. That was always the worst part. He nodded, slow, like the motion itself cost him something he couldn't afford. Then he reached for the gun beside him. Don't, Kaylin said. I'm not going to use it. He picked it up, ejected the magazine, pulled the slide back to clear the chamber, and set all 3 pieces on the floor in front of him. Disassembled, neutralized, harmless. A weapon taken apart by the hands that had carried it. I'm done, he said, with all of it. Declan's people took Adrian out of the room. Not gently, not roughly. With the efficient indifference of men who dealt with damaged things on a regular basis and had learned to handle them without attachment. Kaylin watched him go. Watched the man who had defined her 20s walk down a hallway littered with shell casings and into a morning that was just beginning to turn gold at the edges. And she felt something that she hadn't expected to feel. Not hatred, not forgiveness. Grief. The particular grief that comes from watching something that was never good finally become what it should have been, too late, after too much damage, in a room full of blood that didn't need to be spilled. The helicopter arrived 19 minutes later. Medical evacuation called in by Declan, landing on the compound's north lawn with rotors beating the frozen air into a frenzy that rattled the remaining windows in the main building. Roman was loaded on a stretcher, IV already running, compression bandage soaked through and replaced twice. Kaylin climbed in beside him. Nobody told her she couldn't. Nobody would have dared. The flight to the trauma center in Chicago took 31 minutes. She held Roman's hand the entire time. His fingers were cold, limp. But every few minutes, so faintly she might have been imagining it, they tightened around hers. A pressure so slight it could have been a muscle spasm or a reflex or the involuntary firing of a nervous system that was shutting down in stages. But she chose to believe it was intentional. She chose to believe he knew she was there. He went into surgery at 7:42 a.m. The bullet had nicked his hepatic artery. The surgeon, a woman with steady hands and a face that communicated nothing except competence, told Kaylin it would be 5 hours, maybe 6. She said the words significant blood loss and guarded prognosis, and Kaylin heard them the way you hear traffic noise from inside a building, present, constant, carrying information you don't want to process. She sat in a waiting room that smelled like floor cleaner and stale coffee, and she stared at her hands, still red. She'd washed them twice in the helicopter and once in the hospital bathroom, and the blood was gone, but the color remained in her mind, a stain that existed not on the skin but underneath it, in the tissue, in the muscle, in the bone. She had killed a man. She had fired 3 bullets into a human being, and one of those bullets had ended his life, and his body was lying on frozen ground outside a compound in Lake County, and the last thing he'd seen before the glass broke behind him was her face. She waited. 6 hours became 7. 7 became 8. Declan appeared at some point with coffee she didn't drink and information she couldn't absorb. The compound was being cleaned, evidence removed, official narratives constructed, the machinery of concealment operating with the same efficiency that the machinery of violence had operated with 12 hours earlier. The dead were being buried in stories. The truth was being folded into shapes that fit inside legal frameworks and official reports, and the kind of explanations that satisfied investigators who didn't want to look too closely. Adrian was in custody, not police custody, Roman's custody, held in a location Declan didn't specify, awaiting a decision about what to do with him that nobody was in a position to make because the only person with that authority was on an operating table with a damaged artery and 6 pints of replacement blood. At 3:47 p.m., the surgeon came out. Kaylin stood, her legs held, barely. He's stable, the surgeon said. The arterial repair is holding. Barring complications, he'll recover. Full recovery will take months. He's going to need significant rehabilitation. Kaylin sat back down. Not because her legs gave out, because the weight of the word stable hit her like a physical force and she needed something solid underneath her to absorb the impact. She saw him the next morning. I see you. Machines beeping in rhythms that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat, tubes and wires connecting his body to systems that were doing the work his organs were too damaged to do alone. His face was the color of ash. His eyes, when they opened, were cloudy and slow, and it took them several seconds to find her and several more to focus. "You're here," he said. His voice was paper. Dust. Something that had been through fire and come out the other side, stripped of everything that made it recognizable, except the essential frequency underneath. "I'm here." "Moretti?" "Dead." "Adrian?" "Alive. Contained." Roman closed his eyes. Breathed. The machines beeped. The fluorescent light hummed. "I need to tell you something," he said. "It can wait." "It can't." He opened his eyes again. Found hers. And what she saw in them was not the gray emptiness of the man she'd met in a conference room 6 months ago. Something had been stripped away by the blood loss and the surgery and the hours of unconsciousness, some protective layer that had been keeping the core of him hidden. And what remained was raw and visible and vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. "The money laundering," he said. "The operations, all of it. I'm shutting it down, not reducing, not transitioning, shutting down. Every dirty dollar, every shell company, every operation that can't survive in daylight." He paused, swallowed. The effort of speaking was visible in the tendons of his neck, in the strain around his eyes. "I watched you walk into that room, with a gun, to save me. And I thought, if she dies here, she dies because I built something that put her in this room. And everything I told myself about why I built it, my mother, my father, power, protection, never being powerless again, none of it matters if the thing I built kills the one person who—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. The machines beeped. "The one person who what?" Kaylin said. Roman looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, his eyes were wet. "The one person who made me want to be something other than what I am." The words filled the room the way light fills a space when a door opens. Slowly, then all at once, reaching into corners that had been dark for so long they'd forgotten what illumination felt like. Kaylin leaned forward, placed her hand over his on the hospital bed. His skin was warm now, warmer than it had been in the helicopter. The monitors showed a heartbeat that was steady and strong and mechanical in its regularity, a rhythm rebuilt by surgical precision and blood transfusions and the stubborn refusal of a body to stop functioning. "Then be something other than what you are," she said, "and I'll do the same." It took 14 months. 14 months of lawyers and accountants and federal investigators who circled Roman's empire like wolves around a wounded animal, probing for weakness, looking for the entry point that would let them bring the whole structure down. The encrypted drives Kaylin had made became her leverage, not against Roman, but for him. She negotiated with prosecutors, handed over financial records, provided testimony in sealed proceedings that resulted in the dismantling of 16 shell companies, the closure of 4 illegal operations, and the restructuring of Roman's entire business portfolio into something that could withstand the full light of federal scrutiny without casting a shadow. Roman cooperated. Fully. Not because he'd found morality. He was too honest with himself for that kind of self-deception. He cooperated because he'd found something he valued more than power, and the price of keeping it was everything he'd built his identity around. Adrian Cross pleaded guilty to assault charges in Cook County. Kaylin testified. She sat in a witness chair in a courtroom that smelled like wood polish and old carpet, and she described in clinical detail 3 years of violence. Every bruise, every fracture, every night spent counting seconds on a kitchen floor, while a man who claimed to love her demonstrated what love looked like when it was stripped of everything except possession. Adrian sat 15 feet away and listened with his head bowed and his broken fingers interlaced on the defense table. And when she was finished, when the last word had left her mouth, and the courtroom was silent with the particular silence that follows testimony so raw it burns the air, he looked at her. Just once. And what she saw in his eyes was not the rage or the self-pity or the calculated remorse she'd spent 3 years learning to read. It was recognition. The recognition of a man seeing, clearly and for the first time, the full scope of what he had destroyed. He received 7 years. No parole eligibility for 5. When the bailiff let him out, Kaylin watched him go. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't feel the tightening in her chest that his presence had triggered for years. She felt nothing. And the absence of feeling was not numbness, it was completion. The final severance of a bond that had been made of fear and maintained by habit, and broken, at last, by something stronger than both. The foundation was Kaylin's idea. She designed it during the months of legal proceedings. Sitting at the desk in the Milwaukee apartment she'd returned to after the war ended, working late into the night with spreadsheets and organizational charts and funding models spread across every surface. She knew what survivors needed because she'd been one. She knew what they didn't need because she'd received it: pity, platitudes, the well-meaning condescension of people who understood abuse the way tourists understand a country they've driven through without stopping. The Mercer Viscari Foundation opened its first center in Milwaukee 18 months after the war ended, a converted warehouse in Walker's Point, the same neighborhood where Kaylin had first discovered the truth about Roman's operations, the same street she'd driven through at 4 in the morning while the world she'd built was collapsing around her. The building was renovated with clean lines and warm light, and every room was designed for a specific purpose: legal aid, housing assistance, counseling, job training, childcare. Every door locked from the inside. She named the children's wing after Paul Resnick. Roman attended the opening. Thinner than he'd been. A cane he used without self-consciousness. The limp from his injury permanent and incorporated into his movement the way scars are incorporated into skin. Present, visible, accepted. He stood beside Kaylin while women walked through the doors carrying children and paperwork, and the particular expression that Kaylin recognized because she'd worn it herself for 3 years. The expression of someone who has been told that help exists and doesn't believe it yet, but has run out of alternatives to believing. They built 3 more centers over the next 2 years: Chicago, Indianapolis, Bloomington. That one Kaylin chose deliberately, placing it in the town where her mother lived. The woman who had called every Sunday and accepted every excuse and had finally, in a conversation that lasted 4 hours and included tears and silences and the kind of honesty that strips the varnish off 30 years of family mythology, learned the truth about what her daughter had survived and what her daughter had become. On a Tuesday evening in November, 3 years after a woman in a stairwell had dialed a number on a white card, Kaylin stood on the balcony of the penthouse apartment she shared with Roman, 14 stories above the Milwaukee skyline. The city spread beneath her in a grid of light and shadow, beautiful and violent and alive. The same city that had been her cage and her battlefield and her liberation, depending on which version of herself she was remembering. Roman came out to stand beside her. No cane tonight. The limp was there, but the cane was inside, leaning against the wall by the door. And the fact that he'd left it behind was its own kind of statement. A man choosing discomfort over dependence, choosing to stand on his own damaged legs because standing on your own was the whole point of everything they'd survived. Board meeting went long, he said. The Indianapolis expansion? The zoning committee wants additional environmental reviews. It'll add 3 months to the timeline. I'll call their office tomorrow. I know the committee chair. She owes me a favor from the housing code revision last spring. Roman looked at her. In the city light, his face was all planes and angles, the same face she'd seen in a conference room a lifetime ago, except the eyes were different now. Not warmer exactly. Roman would never be warm, but less guarded, more willing to be seen, more willing to let the thing that lived behind the gray, the grief and the rage, and the tenderness he'd spent 30 years treating like a weakness, exist in the open, in the space between them, without defense. Do you regret it? He asked. Any of it. Kaylin looked at the city, thought about the bruises, thought about the stairwell, thought about the conference room and the diner and the operations bunker and the compound and the helicopter and the hospital room and the courtroom and every room in between. Thought about the woman she'd been at 25, moving in with a man who made her laugh, and the woman she'd been at 28, pressing concealer into fingerprints on her throat, and the woman she was now, at 31, standing 14 stories above a city she'd helped burn and helped rebuild, beside a man she'd helped save and helped dismantle and helped reconstruct into something that could exist in daylight. I regret Paul Resnick, she said. I'll always regret Paul Resnick, and Margaret Doyle, and every person who got hurt because we were too busy being damaged to see the damage we were causing. But I don't regret standing up. I don't regret the stairwell. I don't regret driving 112 miles an hour on a highway at 5 in the morning to walk into a room with a gun I'd never held before. She paused, The night air was cold on her face. The city hummed beneath her, 16 million small decisions happening simultaneously, people choosing and failing and surviving and starting over. The endless machinery of human existence grinding forward because that's what it does. It grinds forward, regardless of what gets caught in the gears. I don't regret choosing, even when every choice was wrong. Choosing was the thing that saved me. Roman was quiet for a long time. The city breathed below them. Somewhere a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere a door opened and closed. Somewhere a woman was sitting in a bathroom at 5 in the morning, pressing concealer into bruises, rehearsing the lies she'd tell the world today. And somewhere, maybe in Milwaukee, maybe in Chicago, maybe in a town Kaylin would never visit, that woman would find a number, a card, a door that locked from the inside, a room designed by someone who understood what she needed, because that someone had once needed it too. "No," Kaylin said. "I don't regret it." Roman took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, the knuckles still thick and misaligned from decades of damage given and received. But the hand was steady. No tremor, no calculation behind the touch, just contact. Two people standing beside each other because they'd chosen to, because choice was the only thing that mattered, because freedom wasn't the absence of darkness, but the ability to walk through it without letting it own you. The city stretched below them, endless and imperfect and blazing with light. And Kaylin Mercer, the woman who had survived, who had been used, who had killed, who had built, who had burned, who had chosen, stood at the edge of it all and belonged to no one. No one except herself.